The foundations of systematic taxation in England emerged from the shadowed centuries following Roman withdrawal, when the very concept of organized tribute collection required reconstruction from fragmentary institutional memory and the practical necessities of warrior kingship across a fragmented landscape of competing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's dive in. The earliest recognizable forms of English taxation crystallized during the 7th and 8th centuries, when Anglo-Saxon kings began developing administrative mechanisms that could extract resources from agricultural populations settled across the lowland zones that would eventually coalesce into the English kingdom. These primitive taxation systems bore little resemblance to the sophisticated fiscal apparatus that would emerge in later centuries, operating instead through a complex web of customary obligations that bound free peasants, slaves, and nobles into hierarchical relationships defined primarily through personal loyalty and military service rather than monetary exchange. The geld, which would later become the most significant tax in pre-Norman England, originated in this period as a levy assessed on landholdings measured in hides, a unit of agricultural productivity that theoretically represented the amount of land necessary to support a single household, though the actual acreage varied considerably depending on soil quality, climate conditions, and regional agricultural practices. The imposition of these early land taxes required rudimentary surveying capabilities and record-keeping systems that Anglo-Saxon administrators developed through adaptation of techniques borrowed from both continental European precedents and the institutional memories preserved within monasteries that maintained written records in an otherwise largely illiterate society. The assessment and collection of these taxes involved local officials who held positions designated by Old English terms that would gradually evolve into the administrative vocabulary of medieval English governance, including the reeve, whose responsibilities encompassed tax collection alongside judicial functions and the management of royal estates within specific territorial jurisdictions. The revenue generated through these early taxation systems supported the military establishments that Anglo-Saxon kings maintained for defense against external threats and for the prosecution of the frequent warfare that characterized relationships between competing kingdoms, while also funding the royal households that served as centers of political power and patronage distribution. The conversion of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to Christianity during the 7th and 8th centuries introduced additional taxation mechanisms as royal authorities began collecting ecclesiastical tithes and supporting church construction through levies that reflected the increasing integration of religious and secular power structures. The Viking invasions that commenced with the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 fundamentally transformed English taxation systems by creating unprecedented military pressures that required expanded revenue collection, capabilities beyond what traditional customary obligations could provide. The Danish armies that ravaged coastal regions and eventually conquered substantial portions of eastern and northern England operated on scales that exceeded the capacity of existing military forces to resist, forcing Anglo-Saxon kings to develop new fiscal instruments capable of funding expanded defensive preparations and, when military resistance proved inadequate, purchasing temporary peace through enormous tribute payments. The Danegeld emerged as the most significant fiscal innovation of the late Anglo-Saxon period, representing England's first systematic national tax imposed across multiple kingdoms and collected with unprecedented administrative sophistication. King Ethelred the Unready's initial levy of Danegeld in 991 established the precedent for regular nationwide taxation, assessed at standardized rates across all land holdings, creating fiscal mechanisms that would persist long after the immediate Danish military threat had subsided. The first recorded Danegeld payment amounted to £10,000 of silver, an enormous sum that required the mobilization of England's entire monetary economy and demonstrated both the severity of the Viking threat and the administrative capacity that Anglo-Saxon governance had achieved by the late 10th century. The assessment of Danegeld required detailed knowledge of land holdings throughout the kingdom, necessitating the development of written records that documented property ownership, land values, and tax obligations with a precision that prefigured the comprehensive surveys that would characterize later medieval administration. The collection process involved hierarchical networks of local officials responsible for gathering the assessed taxes from individual landholders within their jurisdictions and delivering the accumulated funds to royal officials, consolidated the national revenue, creating administrative structures that linked the most remote rural settlements to the central government through chains of fiscal accountability. Subsequent Danegeld levies increased in both frequency and amount as Viking military pressure intensified during the reign of Ethelred, with payments reaching £24,000 in 1007, £30,000 in 1012, and culminating in the massive tribute of £48,000 paid to King Canute in 1018, following the Danish conquest of England. These extraordinary fiscal burdens strained the English economy and contributed to political instability by creating widespread resentment among the populations, forced to liquidate assets and bear heavy debt obligations to meet the royal tax demands. Yet they also demonstrated the remarkable administrative sophistication that Anglo-Saxon governance had achieved in its final decades. The Danish kings who ruled England from 1016 through 1042 maintained the Danegeld as a regular peacetime tax rather than an emergency military levy, transforming it into a permanent feature of English royal finance that generated consistent revenue for governmental operations independent of immediate military necessity. This transformation of an emergency war tax into a regular fiscal instrument established a crucial precedent for the expansion of royal taxation authority that would characterize medieval English governance, as subsequent rulers discovered that temporary taxes imposed during crises could be perpetuated indefinitely once the administrative machinery for their collection had been established and populations had grudgingly accepted their inevitability. The administrative records required for Danegeld assessment and collection created the foundation for the comprehensive land surveys that would culminate in the Domesday Book. As royal officials developed increasingly sophisticated methods for documenting land ownership, agricultural productivity, and population distribution across the English countryside, the social and economic disruption caused by Danegeld collection rippled through Anglo-Saxon society in complex ways that reshaped class relationships and property holdings, as many small landholders found themselves unable to meet their tax obligations and were forced to surrender their properties to more wealthy neighbours or to ecclesiastical institutions that possessed the monetary resources necessary to advance loans against future harvests. The concentration of land ownership that resulted from these fiscal pressures contributed to the development of more rigid social hierarchies that would characterize post-conquest England, as the free peasantry that had formed a substantial segment of Anglo-Saxon society gradually diminished in numbers and independence. The Norman conquest of 1066 occurred at a crucial moment in the development of English taxation systems, when Anglo-Saxon administrative capabilities had reached unprecedented sophistication, but political stability remained fragile following decades of Danish rule and subsequent Saxon restoration under Edward the Confessor. William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings brought to England a ruler whose continental experiences had exposed him to the more developed fiscal systems of Normandy and other French territories, where ducal authority relied on diversified revenue sources that included not only land taxes, but also commercial duties, judicial fees, and feudal obligations of remarkable complexity. The immediate aftermath of the conquest saw William's primary concern focused on securing military control over his new kingdom, rather than developing new taxation mechanisms, as the suppression of English resistance and the establishment of Norman authority required the deployment of military forces across the realm and the construction of the castle networks that would become the most visible symbols of Norman power. However, the fiscal requirements of maintaining these military establishments and rewarding the Norman followers who had supported William's invasion created urgent needs for detailed information about English wealth and property holdings, needs that would culminate in the creation of the most comprehensive administrative survey produced in medieval Europe. The Domesday Book, compiled between 1085 and 1086, represented an extraordinary achievement in governmental data collection that provided William's administration with unprecedented knowledge of English land holdings, agricultural resources, and tax-paying capacity across virtually the entire kingdom. The survey's origins lay in the meeting of William's court at Gloucester during Christmas of 1085, where the king ordered a comprehensive investigation of land ownership and values throughout England, motivated by complex political and fiscal considerations that included concerns about potential Danish invasion, disputes over property rights between Norman settlers and remaining English landholders, and the fundamental need for accurate information about the kingdom's taxable wealth. The administrative operation required to complete the Domesday Survey involved royal commissioners travelling throughout England county by county, holding inquiries at which local juries composed of both Norman and English residents provided sworn testimony about land ownership, values, and obligations for every manor and settlement within their knowledge. The information gathered through these inquiries was systematically recorded in Latin, following standardized formats that documented the identity of current landholders, the names of those who had held the same properties before the conquest, the extent of agricultural land measured in various units, including hides, ploughlands, and other regional measures, the number of ploughs, mills, and other productive assets, the population of various classes, including slaves, free peasants, and lesser nobility, and the assessed annual value of each property for both the period before the conquest and the current time. The compilation of this massive dataset into the 2 volumes that constitute the Domesday Book required sophisticated clerical capabilities and represented one of the largest writing projects undertaken in medieval Europe, creating a permanent written record that would serve as the foundation for English property law and taxation for centuries. The immediate fiscal impact of the Domesday Survey lay in its provision of accurate baseline information for the assessment of taxes, particularly the continuation of the Danegeld that William maintained as a regular royal revenue source, despite its original purpose as an emergency military tax. The Domesday Book's documentation of land values and ownership enabled more equitable and efficient tax collection by eliminating disputes over property holdings and tax liabilities, while also revealing discrepancies between nominal tax assessments and actual land values that allowed for adjustments in the tax system. Beyond its immediate fiscal applications, the Domesday Book established principles of governmental information gathering and administrative documentation that would influence English governance throughout the medieval period and beyond, demonstrating the power of systematic record-keeping to enhance royal authority and enable more effective administration of increasingly complex governmental functions. The development of feudal taxation structures during the century following the Norman conquest created complex systems of fiscal obligation that intertwined land ownership with military service and monetary payments in ways that distributed the burdens of supporting royal government across the various classes of medieval English society. The feudal system that William and his successors imposed on England rested fundamentally on the principle that all land ultimately belonged to the crown, with nobles, knights, and other landholders receiving their properties in exchange for specified services and payments that created cascading chains of obligation, linking every landholder to the king through intermediate lords. The primary feudal obligations included military service, by which tenants-in-chief who held land directly from the crown were required to provide specified numbers of armed knights for royal military campaigns for designated periods each year, typically 40 days, creating a military force that could be mobilized for defensive operations or foreign wars without direct monetary expense to the crown. However, the practical difficulties of maintaining military forces through service obligations rather than paid professional soldiers became increasingly apparent as military campaigns expanded in scope and duration, leading to the gradual transformation of service obligations into monetary payments known as scutage, literally shield money, by which landholders could discharge their military obligations through cash payments that enabled kings to hire professional soldiers who could serve for longer periods and with greater reliability than feudal levies. The introduction of scutage during the reign of Henry I in the early 12th century marked a crucial transition from a primarily service-based feudal system toward a more monetized economy, in which cash payments, increasingly first replaced personal service as the medium through which subjects met their obligations to the crown. The rates of scutage varied according to military necessity and royal fiscal requirements, with assessments sometimes reaching as high as £2 or £3 per knight's fee. Substantial sums that placed heavy burdens on landholders and generated significant resistance that would contribute to the constitutional conflicts of the 13th century. Beyond scutage, the feudal system generated royal revenue through various incidents of tenure that occurred at specific moments in the relationship between lords and vassals, including reliefs, which were payments made by heirs to inherit their predecessors' lands, typically amounting to 1 year's revenue from the estate; wardship, by which the crown assumed control of estates and their revenues when heirs were minors, often exploiting these properties far beyond their sustainable capacity during the wardship period; and marriage, which gave the crown the right to arrange marriages for heiresses and female wards, often selling these marriage rights to the highest bidders who saw opportunities for gaining control of valuable estates through strategic matches. These feudal incidents represented particularly objectionable forms of taxation because they occurred at moments of family vulnerability and could involve arbitrary valuations and exploitative management that enriched royal coffers at the expense of aristocratic estates and family interests. The forest laws that Norman kings imposed across vast areas of England created additional revenue sources through the imposition of fines for violations of hunting restrictions and other regulations governing land use within royal forests, which at their maximum extent covered approximately 1/3 of England's land area and subjected both nobles and commoners to oppressive legal restrictions that were widely resented and frequently challenged. The expansion of royal forest boundaries during the 12th century reflected the fiscal value of forest fines and fees rather than genuine conservation concerns. As successive kings extended forest boundaries to encompass productive agricultural lands and settlements solely to subject their inhabitants to forest law and the revenues it generated. The forest courts, known as Ire of the Forest, periodically toured forest regions to hear cases and impose fines, generating substantial revenues while simultaneously creating widespread antagonism toward royal authority that would contribute to the political pressures leading to Magna Carta. The increasing fiscal demands of the Angevin kings during the late 12th century created unprecedented strains on the English taxation system, as Henry II and his sons, Richard and John, pursued expensive foreign policies that required revenues far exceeding what traditional feudal sources could provide. Henry II's extensive continental possessions, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, required constant military and administrative expenditure to maintain Norman authority against rebellious vassals and rival powers, while his legal and administrative reforms in England, though ultimately strengthening royal authority, required substantial initial investments in expanding the bureaucratic apparatus of government. The Saladin tithe of 1188 represented a watershed moment in English taxation history as the first attempt to impose a general tax on movable property rather than on land alone, establishing a precedent for taxing commercial wealth and personal property that would become increasingly important as England's economy developed beyond its primarily agricultural base. The tax was assessed at 10% of all movable goods and revenues, with elaborate procedures for verification and collection that involved local juries, swearing to the accuracy of assessments, and royal officials conducting investigations to detect evasion, creating administrative challenges that prefigured the difficulties that would plague attempts to tax movable wealth throughout the medieval period. The revenues generated by the Saladin tithe, intended to fund the Third Crusade, demonstrated both the potential of broad-based taxation and the administrative difficulties involved in its collection, as widespread evasion and resistance limited the actual yield far below theoretical expectations. Richard I's reign from 1189 to 1199 imposed even greater fiscal burdens on England, despite the king's physical absence for most of his reign, as the costs of his participation in the Third Crusade and subsequent imprisonment in Germany required the extraction of enormous sums through taxation, feudal incidents, and the sale of royal offices and privileges. The ransom for Richard's release, amounting to 100,000 marks, required unprecedented fiscal mobilization that included special taxes on movable property, exploitation of feudal incidents, seizure of church treasure, and forced loans from wealthy subjects, creating economic disruption and political resentment that would complicate his brother John's subsequent efforts to maintain royal authority. King John's reign, from 1199 to 1216, witnessed the culmination of tensions over royal taxation that had been building throughout the Angevin period, as John's loss of most English continental possessions created both a fiscal crisis resulting from reduced revenues from French territories and military expenses associated with attempts to recover lost lands, and political pressures from nobles who resented the extraordinary fiscal demands the king imposed to fund his military campaigns. John's exploitation of feudal incidents reached levels that his predecessors had carefully avoided, with arbitrary assessments of reliefs at amounts far exceeding customary rates. Prolonged wardships managed to maximize revenue extraction at the expense of estate values, and forced marriages arranged to generate the highest possible fees, rather than to serve the interests of families and heirs. The quarrel between John and Pope Innocent III over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury led to England's placement under interdict from 1208 to 1213, during which period John exploited the situation to seize church revenues and property, generating substantial short-term income while creating lasting antagonism from ecclesiastical authorities who would play crucial roles in the baronial opposition that culminated in Magna Carta. The disastrous military campaign in France during 1214, ending in defeat at the Battle of Bouvines and the permanent loss of Normandy and other continental territories, destroyed whatever remaining credibility John possessed and created the political conditions for baronial revolt. The negotiation and promulgation of Magna Carta in 1215 represented a fundamental turning point in English constitutional and fiscal history, establishing principles of limited royal authority and consent to taxation that would influence English political development for centuries, even though many of the Charter's specific provisions proved difficult to enforce and would be repeatedly violated by subsequent monarchs. The immediate circumstances leading to Magna Carta involved John's attempts to raise an army and funding for yet another campaign to recover his lost French territories, demands that pushed the English baronage beyond what they were willing to tolerate and led to armed rebellion by a substantial faction of nobles who renounced their feudal obligations to the king and occupied London in May 1215. The negotiations at Runnymede in June 1215 produced a document that addressed baronial grievances across a wide range of issues, but several provisions dealt specifically with taxation and the fiscal relationships between the crown and its subjects, establishing principles that would be repeatedly invoked in subsequent constitutional conflicts. Article 12 of Magna Carta stated that no scutage or aid shall be imposed in our kingdom unless by the common council of our kingdom, except for ransoming our person, making our eldest son a knight, and once for marrying our eldest daughter, and for these only a reasonable aid shall be levied, establishing the principle that extraordinary taxation required consent from those who would be taxed rather than being subject to unilateral royal imposition. This provision represented a radical limitation on royal fiscal authority, though its practical implementation remained vague and contested, particularly regarding what constituted the common council of the kingdom and through what mechanisms such consent should be obtained. Article 15 extended similar protections to non-royal subjects by stipulating that no freeman shall be compelled to make aids, except those mentioned above, creating limitations on feudal taxation that protected lesser landholders from arbitrary demands by their immediate lords. Additional articles addressed specific fiscal grievances, including provisions limiting reliefs to customary rates, establishing procedures for managing wardships to prevent exploitation, and restricting the Crown's ability to seize property in satisfaction of debts. Article 48 provided for the immediate establishment of commissions to investigate and abolish evil customs related to forests, warrens, foresters, and sheriffs, addressing the oppressive forest laws and corrupt administrative practices that had generated widespread resentment. The immediate aftermath of Magna Carta saw both sides violate the agreement almost immediately, with John obtaining papal annulment of the charter on the grounds that it had been extracted under duress, while the baronial party invited the French Prince Louis to invade England and claim the throne, plunging the kingdom into civil war that continued until John's death in October 1216. The reissue of Magna Carta in 1216 by the Regency government, acting in the name of John's young son Henry III, demonstrated the document's value as a statement of political principles that could command broad support and provide legitimacy to a government facing challenges to its authority, even if many specific provisions remained unenforceable in practice. Subsequent reissues and confirmations of Magna Carta throughout the 13th century gradually strengthened its status as a fundamental constitutional document that established principles of limited government and consent to taxation. Even though the practical implementation of these principles remained contested, and monarchs regularly found ways to circumvent or ignore the Charter's restrictions when political circumstances allowed. The long reign of Henry III, from 1216 to 1272, witnessed repeated conflicts over taxation, as the king's expensive foreign policy initiatives and lavish patronage of foreign favourites created fiscal demands that exceeded traditional revenue sources and required repeated requests for grants of taxation from assemblies of nobles and prelates. The development of these assemblies into representative institutions with recognised authority to grant or refuse taxation would prove crucial for the evolution of parliamentary government in England, though the process occurred gradually and irregularly through the 13th century, without clear institutional continuity or established procedures. The provisions of Oxford in 1258, imposed on Henry by baronial reformers, led by Simon de Montfort, established a council of 15 barons who would control royal government and approve all major policy decisions, including taxation, representing an attempt to institutionalize the principle of consent to taxation established in Magna Carta, and to create permanent mechanisms for limiting royal fiscal authority. The civil war that erupted between Henry and the reformist barons in 1263 ended with Simon de Montfort's defeat and death at the Battle of Evesham in 1265. But the constitutional principles for which the reformers had fought continued to influence political discourse and would be revived in subsequent conflicts over royal authority. The reign of Edward I, from 1272 to 1307, witnessed both the expansion of royal fiscal capacity and the development of parliamentary institutions that would eventually establish regular procedures for negotiating taxation between crown and subjects. Though this development occurred through pragmatic responses to immediate political pressures rather than through systematic constitutional design. Edward's expensive military campaigns in Wales, Scotland, and France created fiscal demands that far exceeded the revenues available from traditional sources, including royal estates, feudal incidents, customs duties, and the Jews, who remained a crucial source of royal revenue through special taxation until their expulsion in 1290. The conquest of Wales between 1277 and 1283 required not only military expenditure during the campaigns themselves, but also massive investment in the construction of the great castles, including Caernarfon, Conwy, and Harlech, that would secure English control over the conquered territories, projects that represented some of the most expensive building programs undertaken by any medieval European monarch. The Scottish Wars that began in 1296 and would continue intermittently for decades created even greater fiscal pressures as Edward attempted to impose English overlordship over Scotland through repeated military campaigns that proved far more difficult and expensive than the Welsh Wars, requiring the mobilization of large armies that needed to be paid and supplied during extended operations in hostile territory. The financing of these military commitments required repeated grants of taxation from assemblies that gradually evolved into the institution that would be recognized as Parliament, though the early stages of this evolution lacked the clear institutional structure and established procedures that would characterize later parliamentary development. The Model Parliament of 1295, traditionally regarded as a crucial step in parliamentary evolution, brought together not only nobles and prelates, but also representatives of counties and boroughs, creating a broadly representative assembly that could speak for the entire realm in granting taxation, though the circumstances of its convening and the extent to which it established precedents for future assemblies remain debated among historians. The financing arrangements for Edward's military campaigns involved complex negotiations between the crown and various constituencies, including the nobility, the clergy, and the emerging class of wealthy merchants whose commercial activities generated taxable wealth, but who demanded consideration of their interests in return for tax grants. The clergy presented particular challenges for royal taxation because ecclesiastical revenues theoretically belonged to the church rather than being subject to secular authority, leading to repeated conflicts between Edward and successive popes over the taxation of English clergy, conflicts that culminated in the papal bull, Clericis Laicos, in 1296, which prohibited clergy from paying taxes to secular rulers without papal consent, a prohibition that Edward circumvented through various expedients, including declaring clergy outside royal protection and therefore vulnerable to legal persecution unless they made payments to the crown. The development of customs duties during Edward's reign created a permanent source of royal revenue that did not require parliamentary consent because it was theoretically a voluntary payment by merchants in exchange for royal protection and commercial privileges rather than a direct tax on subjects, though this fiction became increasingly difficult to maintain as customs duties expanded and rates increased. The establishment of standard customs duties on wool exports in 1275 created the foundation for customs revenue that would remain a crucial component of royal finance throughout the medieval and early modern periods, with wool being England's primary export commodity and therefore providing a stable tax base that generated consistent revenue without requiring the administrative apparatus necessary for direct taxation of land or movable property. The maltote, an additional customs duty imposed by Edward in 1294 without consent from merchants or Parliament, provoked significant opposition and had to be repealed in 1297 under pressure from a coalition of merchants and nobility who objected to the king's unilateral imposition of new taxation, demonstrating the growing strength of the principle that even indirect taxes required some form of consent from affected parties. Edward's financial pressures toward the end of his reign became so severe that he resorted to increasingly desperate expedients, including the seizure of wool from merchants with promises of future payment that were never fulfilled, forced loans from wealthy subjects, manipulation of the coinage through debasement, and exploitation of every available feudal incident and judicial fine, creating widespread resentment that weakened royal authority and contributed to the political instability that would characterize his son's reign. The disastrous reign of Edward II, from 1307 to 1327, demonstrated how fiscal mismanagement and inability to secure adequate revenues could contribute to political collapse, as the king's failure in Scottish wars, incompetent administration, and lavish favoritism toward unpopular companions alienated potential supporters while failing to generate sufficient revenues to maintain effective government or military capability. The continuing Scottish wars, following Robert Bruce's victory at Bannockburn in 1314, required enormous expenditures that Edward proved unable to finance through the traditional means of parliamentary grants, forced loans, and feudal levies, while simultaneously his unpopular favourites, particularly Piers Gaveston and later the Despencer family, enriched themselves through corrupt manipulation of royal patronage and financial resources, creating scandals that undermined support for additional taxation. The baronial opposition that repeatedly challenged Edward's authority and eventually engineered his deposition in 1327 justified their actions partly through reference to the king's fiscal incompetence, corruption, establishing precedents for the idea that monarchs who failed to govern effectively and manage royal finances responsibly might forfeit their right to rule, a concept that would reappear in later constitutional conflicts. The brief reign of the young Edward III under his mother Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer saw the execution of the Despensers and the implementation of reforms intended to address the fiscal and administrative failures of the previous reign, though the regime's own corruption and unpopularity led to Mortimer's execution in 1330 and Edward's assumption of personal rule. Edward III's long personal reign, from 1330 to 1377, witnessed both the expansion of English military power through the early campaigns of the Hundred Years' War and the development of more sophisticated parliamentary procedures for granting taxation, creating patterns of fiscal military statecraft that would characterize English monarchy through the later medieval period. The outbreak of war with France in 1337 created immediate fiscal pressures that required parliamentary grants of taxation on scales unprecedented in English history. As Edward's strategic vision of conquering France through combinations of military campaigns, diplomatic alliances, and support for Flemish commercial partners required expenditures far exceeding anything his predecessors had attempted. The spectacular English military victories at Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356 demonstrated the effectiveness of English military innovations, including the tactical use of longbowmen, but the campaigns that produced these victories required enormous financial investments in raising, equipping, transporting, and maintaining armies that operated on continental soil, sometimes for years at a time. The financing of these military efforts required repeated parliamentary grants of taxation that established patterns of regular parliamentary meetings and systematic procedures for negotiating between Crown and Commons over the rates, forms, and purposes of taxation. The evolution of Parliament during Edward III's reign created the institutional framework that would characterize English representative government for centuries, with the separation of Lords and Commons into distinct houses, the recognition of the Commons' right to initiate tax legislation, and the development of procedures by which Commons could attach conditions to tax grants requiring the redress of grievances or the implementation of specific policies. The granting of poll taxes during the 1370s represented a significant fiscal innovation by which taxes were assessed as flat amounts per person rather than as percentages of property values or revenues, creating theoretically simpler assessment and collection procedures while shifting tax burdens away from wealthy landowners toward the broader population, including poor labourers who possessed little property but could be required to pay fixed amounts per head. The first poll tax in 1377 was assessed at 4 pence per person over the age of 14, a relatively modest amount that generated substantial revenue with minimal opposition, encouraging the government to employ similar taxes in subsequent years when war expenses required additional funds beyond what traditional land and movable property taxes could provide. The intensification of poll taxes during the late 1370s culminated in the disastrous third poll tax of 1380, which attempted to assess graded amounts based on social status, but in practice imposed burdens far exceeding what most common people could afford, particularly given the economic disruptions caused by recurring plague outbreaks and the oppressive labour regulations that had been imposed following the Black Death in 1348. The Black Death itself had fundamentally altered the economic and fiscal landscape of England by killing approximately 1/3 to 1/2 of the population within a few years, creating severe labour shortages that should have benefited surviving workers through increased wages and improved bargaining positions, but instead prompting governmental responses, including the Statute of Labourers in 1351, which attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict worker mobility, creating deep resentments among the labouring classes who saw themselves exploited by landlords and government alike. The third poll tax's assessment at varying rates that in many cases reached 3 groats, equivalent to 12 pence or 3 days' wages for a common labourer, proved impossible for many households to pay and provoked widespread resistance that included evasion, false reporting, and ultimately violent rebellion when collectors attempted to enforce payment through coercive measures. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 erupted in Essex and Kent during May and early June, when poll tax collectors met violent resistance from communities that refused to pay the assessed amounts, with the rebellion quickly spreading across southeastern England as tens of thousands of peasants, artisans, and minor landholders joined the uprising and marched on London, demanding the abolition of serfdom, the repeal of oppressive labour laws, and the punishment of corrupt officials held responsible for fiscal oppression. The rebels' capture of London in mid-June 1381 and their meetings with the young King Richard II at Mile End and Smithfield demonstrated both the scale of popular anger over taxation and labour policies, and the limited political sophistication of the movement, which lacked clear leadership or coherent programmes beyond the immediate grievances that had sparked the uprising. The execution of Archbishop Simon Sudbury, who as Chancellor bore official responsibility for the poll tax, and the Treasurer Robert Hales by rebel mobs at the Tower of London represented direct reprisals against officials held responsible for fiscal oppression, establishing precedents for the idea that unjust taxation could justify violent resistance against governmental authority. The suppression of the peasants' revolt following the death of the rebel leader Wat Tyler at Smithfield and the subsequent judicial retaliation against participants demonstrated the limits of popular resistance against established authority, but the experience sufficiently traumatized the English governing classes that poll taxes would not be attempted again for over 3 centuries. And more generally, the rebellion contributed to gradual moderation of the harshest labour regulations and feudal obligations that had provoked such widespread anger. The fiscal consequences of the revolt included immediate abandonment of attempts to collect the remaining unpaid portions of the third poll tax and a return to reliance on more traditional forms of taxation, including customs duties and taxes on movable property. Though the incident demonstrated the practical limits of fiscal extraction and the dangers of imposing taxes that exceeded population's capacity or willingness to pay. The later years of Richard II's reign, from 1381 to 1399, witnessed increasing conflicts over royal finances and parliamentary authority, as Richard attempted to establish more absolutist forms of monarchy that would free him from dependence on parliamentary grants, while Parliament sought to expand its control over royal finances and ensure that tax revenues were used for purposes that benefited the kingdom, rather than merely supporting royal extravagance and favouritism. The constitutional conflicts of the late 1380s and 1390s created precedents for parliamentary oversight of royal finances, including the appointment of parliamentary commissions to audit royal accounts and ensure proper use of tax revenues, though Richard's resistance to these limitations contributed to the political instability that culminated in his deposition by Henry Bolingbroke in 1399. The Lancastrian dynasty that ruled England from 1399 through 1461 faced perpetual fiscal difficulties that shaped both domestic politics and foreign policy throughout the period. As the dynasty's questionable legitimacy following Henry IV's usurpation of Richard II created political vulnerabilities that limited the new king's ability to resist parliamentary demands for concessions in return for tax grants. Henry IV's reign, from 1399 to 1413, was dominated by internal rebellions and Welsh uprisings that required military expenditure. The king struggled to finance through parliamentary speeches, taxation, particularly given parliamentary suspicions about the legitimacy of his rule and demands for strict accounting of how tax revenues were spent. The development of parliamentary control over appropriations during Henry IV's reign established important precedents by which Parliament could designate specific purposes for which tax revenues could be used and establish oversight mechanisms to ensure compliance with these restrictions, limiting the king's freedom to redirect funds according to his own priorities, and creating expectations of fiscal accountability that would characterize English governance through subsequent centuries. Henry V's reign, from 1413 to 1422, witnessed a temporary resolution of the fiscal tensions that had characterized his father's rule, as Henry's military genius and the stunning English victory at Agincourt in 1415 created nationalist enthusiasm that translated into parliamentary willingness to grant substantial taxation to support the conquest of France, though the long-term sustainability of these conquests remained questionable and would impose crippling costs on Henry's successors. The financing of Henry V's French campaigns required not only parliamentary tax grants but also forced loans from wealthy subjects, seizure of church plate and treasure, and manipulation of customs revenues, creating a diversified revenue system that could fund military operations on unprecedented scales, but which depended on continuing military success to maintain political support for the fiscal sacrifices demanded from English society. The minority of Henry VI from 1422 to 1437 and his ineffective personal rule thereafter created fiscal chaos, as the costs of attempting to maintain English conquests in France exceeded available revenues, while military defeats and the final loss of all French territories, except Calais, by 1453 destroyed whatever political will existed to support heavy taxation for foreign wars. The Wars of the Roses that erupted in 1455 and continued intermittently for 3 decades resulted partly from fiscal collapse and the inability of royal government to maintain order or provide effective administration. When revenues proved insufficient to pay for even basic governmental functions, let alone the military forces necessary to suppress rebellion or resist foreign enemies. The complexity of English taxation during the later medieval period reflected the diverse economic bases from which different forms of revenue were drawn, including the traditional land taxes that fell primarily on agricultural wealth, customs duties that affected commercial activities and international trade, taxes on movable property that theoretically captured wealth held in forms other than real estate, feudal incidents that continued to generate revenue when lands changed hands or heirs came of age, and ecclesiastical revenues that the crown could sometimes tap through negotiations with the papacy or through threats of coercion against the English Church. The administration of these various tax systems required substantial bureaucratic capabilities centered in the exchequer, which by the later medieval period had developed sophisticated accounting procedures and record-keeping systems that enabled tracking of revenues from multiple sources, verification of amounts collected against assessments, and investigation of corruption or incompetence by tax collectors and other officials responsible for fiscal administration. The social distribution of tax burdens during the medieval period remained highly unequal, despite theoretical principles that taxation should be proportional to wealth or ability to pay, as the wealthy and powerful possessed numerous methods for evading or minimizing their tax obligations through manipulation of assessments, corruption of officials, exploitation of exemptions and privileges, and simple refusal to pay backed by armed force or political influence, while common people lacked the resources or connections necessary to resist collection efforts and bore disproportionate shares of the actual tax burden. The geographic distribution of taxation also reflected significant inequalities, as different regions of England were assessed at different rates and faced different enforcement vigor depending on local political circumstances, the strength of royal administration in particular areas, and the resistance capacity of local populations. The establishment of the Tudor dynasty in 1485, following Henry VII's victory at Bosworth Field, created new opportunities for fiscal reform and the strengthening of royal finances, as Henry brought to the throne both a cautious personality that emphasized financial security over military glory and administrative talents that enabled systematic exploitation of revenue sources previous kings had neglected or managed incompetently. Henry VII's reign from 1485 to 1509 represented one of the most financially successful periods in English royal history, as the king transformed the crown's fiscal position from the insolvency that had characterized Yorkist rule to substantial accumulated treasure through careful management of traditional revenue sources and innovative exploitation of feudal incidents and legal penalties. The revival of feudal financial rights that had fallen into disuse during the civil wars enabled Henry to extract substantial revenues through wardships, marriages, reliefs, and other incidents of tenure, while his agents systematically investigated land titles and challenged aristocratic landholdings to generate fines and establish royal rights that produced ongoing revenue streams. The use of bonds and recognizances, by which subjects acknowledged debts to the crown for real or alleged offences, created a system of financial surveillance and control over the nobility that enriched the treasury, while simultaneously ensuring political loyalty, as nobles subject to such obligations had strong incentives to maintain the king's favour and avoid actions that might trigger demands for immediate payment of their bonded debts. The expansion of customs revenues during Henry's reign resulted from both the growth of English commerce as the economy recovered from decades of civil warfare and more efficient collection procedures that reduced evasion and corruption, with particular attention to wool exports, which remained the primary source of customs revenue, despite the growing importance of cloth exports that would eventually surpass raw wool in commercial significance. Henry's careful avoidance of foreign wars for most of his reign eliminated the extraordinary military expenses that had bankrupted his predecessors, enabling him to accumulate substantial treasure from ordinary revenues, without requiring frequent parliamentary grants of direct taxation, though he did occasionally summon Parliament to authorize taxes that provided both revenue and political legitimacy for his policies. The fiscal conservatism and administrative efficiency that characterized Henry VII's reign created a strong financial foundation for his son Henry VIII, though the younger Henry's personality and policy priorities would lead to very different patterns of royal finance that would ultimately dissipate the treasure his father had accumulated and create fiscal pressures that would transform English government and society. Henry VIII's reign, from 1509 to 1547, witnessed both the expansion of royal power through the English Reformation and the fiscal strains created by expensive foreign wars and lavish court expenditure that required extraordinary revenue measures, including the dissolution of the monasteries, forced loans, debasement of the coinage, and repeated parliamentary grants of taxation. The early years of Henry's reign saw the rapid expenditure of his father's accumulated treasure on military campaigns in France and Scotland that achieved few lasting results while consuming enormous resources, demonstrating the younger Henry's preference for military glory and conspicuous display over the careful financial management that had characterized his father's rule. The complex political and religious transformation that historians term the English Reformation began in the late 1520s, with Henry's efforts to secure papal approval for the annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. But the fiscal dimensions of the break with Rome proved as significant as its religious and political aspects, as the dissolution of monasteries and appropriation of church property represented the largest transfer of wealth in English history and fundamentally altered patterns of landholding and social relationships. The dissolution of the monasteries between 1536 and 1541 liquidated institutions that controlled approximately 1/4 of England's cultivated land and possessed accumulated wealth in the Yesar. Forms of buildings, precious objects, livestock, and rights over tenants and resources that represented centuries of donations and accumulation, creating a windfall for the crown that temporarily resolved Henry's fiscal difficulties, but which was largely dissipated through continued military expenditure and court extravagance, rather than being invested in ways that would have generated sustainable revenue streams. The process of dissolution began with visitations of religious houses by royal commissioners who compiled evidence of alleged corruption and immorality that would justify their suppression, though the actual motivations were primarily fiscal rather than reformist, and proceeded through parliamentary legislation that transferred monastic properties to the crown in 1536 for smaller houses and 1539 for larger establishments, creating legal frameworks that legitimized what was essentially a massive expropriation. The immediate management of dissolved monastic properties by the Court of Augmentations, a new bureaucratic institution created specifically to handle the enormous administrative burden of processing thousands of properties and converting them into revenue, demonstrated the Tudor government's administrative sophistication, but also revealed the challenges of liquidating complex portfolios of assets in ways that maximized crown revenue while avoiding economic disruption or excessive political resistance. The sale of monastic lands to members of the nobility and gentry created a new social class, with vested interests in maintaining the Reformation settlement and preventing any restoration of monastic institutions that might challenge their property titles, effectively distributing the political risks of the break with Rome across a broad segment of the landed classes, while generating immediate revenue that funded Henry's continuing military adventures in France and Scotland. The fiscal consequences of the dissolution proved disappointing in the long term, despite the enormous wealth initially acquired, as the crown sold most properties relatively quickly at prices below their actual values in order to generate immediate cash, foregoing the rental incomes that monastic estates had previously provided, and which would have created sustainable revenue sources if the crown had retained ownership and managed the properties as ongoing concerns. The military campaigns of the 1540s, including the war with France from 1542 to 1546 and the concurrent Scottish conflicts, consumed the dissolution proceeds and forced Henry to resort to additional extraordinary revenue measures, including forced loans that were never repaid, benevolences, which were theoretically voluntary gifts, but in practice were imposed on wealthy subjects who faced royal displeasure if they refused, debasement of the coinage by reducing the precious metal content of coins while maintaining their face values, and sales of crown lands that further reduced the monarchy's landed revenues and made the government increasingly dependent on parliamentary taxation rather than revenues from royal estates. The debasement of the coinage during the 1540s generated enormous short-term profits for the crown, as the difference between the face value and the actual precious metal content of newly minted coins provided seigneurage, revenue that helped finance military operations. But the policy created severe inflation that reduced the real value of fixed incomes, including many royal revenues, distorted relative prices throughout the economy, and contributed to social unrest as workers struggled with rising prices while wages lagged behind, demonstrating how fiscal expedients adopted to meet immediate revenue needs could create longer-term economic problems that ultimately weakened royal finances. The taxation policies during Henry's later years saw increasing reliance on parliamentary grants of subsidies, a form of direct taxation that theoretically assessed wealth more accurately than older tax forms, but which in practice involved considerable evasion, as local commissioners who assessed their neighbours' wealth tended to underestimate values and overlook assets, reducing the actual yield far below theoretical potential and creating pressures for more frequent grants to meet ongoing fiscal needs. The brief reigns of Edward VI from 1547 to 1553 and Mary I from 1553 to 1558 both faced severe fiscal difficulties that resulted from the depleted state of royal finances following Henry's expenditures, though neither monarch lived long enough to implement sustainable solutions to these structural problems. Edward's minority government confronted fiscal crisis immediately upon his accession, as debts accumulated during Henry's final years came due. The expensive Scottish and French wars continued, and inflation driven by earlier currency debasement eroded the real value of crown revenues, forcing renewed debasement policies that further destabilized the currency and worsened inflationary pressures, while generating diminishing returns as populations adjusted to repeated devaluations. The political instability surrounding Edward's death and the contested succession that briefly elevated Lady Jane Grey before Mary's successful assertion of her claim consumed resources and prevented effective fiscal reform, while Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain and her subsequent involvement in Habsburg wars created military expenses that England could ill afford, given the crown's precarious financial position. The religious reversals that characterized both Edward's strongly Protestant regime and Mary's attempts to restore Catholicism created additional fiscal complexities as properties confiscated from religious institutions changed hands multiple times, creating legal uncertainties about titles and ownership that would require decades to fully resolve. While the persecution of religious minorities under both regimes, though motivated primarily by theological concerns, had fiscal consequences as wealthy merchants and professionals fled England to avoid execution or imprisonment, taking their capital and commercial expertise to more tolerant continental cities. The accession of Elizabeth I in 1558 brought to the throne a monarch whose fiscal policies would be characterized by extreme caution and parsimony that reflected both her personality and her realistic assessment of the crown's weak financial position, as Elizabeth inherited enormous debts, a debased currency, and an administrative apparatus that was both inefficient and corrupt, requiring careful management to restore solvency and avoid the fiscal collapse that had threatened the monarchy during her siblings' reigns. Elizabeth's long reign from 1558 to 1603 witnessed a gradual improvement in royal finances through policies that combined strict economy and expenditure, particularly regarding military commitments that Elizabeth avoided whenever possible through diplomatic maneuvering and support for proxy forces, rather than direct English military intervention. With cautious development of new revenue sources, including more aggressive exploitation of feudal incidents, expansion of customs, revenues through support for commercial expansion, and occasional parliamentary grants during periods of military necessity, such as the war with Spain, from 1585 to 1604. The recoinage of 1561 represented a crucial early achievement of Elizabeth's financial management, as the restoration of silver coins to their proper precious metal content ended the currency instability that had plagued England since the 1540s. Though the operation required careful management to avoid disrupting commerce and to ensure that the costs were distributed fairly, rather than falling primarily on holders of existing debased coins. The expansion of English commerce during Elizabeth's reign, facilitated by royal charters to trading companies, including the Levant Company, the Muscovy Company, and the East India Company, created new sources of customs revenue as English merchants expanded their activities into Mediterranean, Russian, and Asian markets, with the Crown collecting both regular customs duties and special payments from the chartered companies in exchange for their monopoly privileges. The war with Spain that dominated the final 2 decades of Elizabeth's reign created fiscal pressures that required more frequent parliamentary taxation and forced Elizabeth to sell Crown lands to raise immediate funds, continuing the long-term erosion of royal landed revenues that made the monarchy increasingly dependent on parliamentary grants and less able to maintain the fiction of living of the king's own, as monarchs had theoretically been expected to do from their hereditary revenues without regular taxation. The fiscal expedients of Elizabeth's later years included practices that would become increasingly controversial under her Stuart successors, particularly the sale of monopoly privileges, by which individuals or companies purchased exclusive rights to manufacture, import, or sell specific commodities in exchange for payments to the Crown, creating artificial restrictions on commerce that raised prices for consumers and generated political opposition from merchants and Parliament. The accession of James I in 1603 and the establishment of the Stuart dynasty initiated a period of constitutional conflict over taxation and fiscal policy that would ultimately culminate in civil war and revolutionary transformation of English government, as the fundamental incompatibility between Stuart conceptions of royal authority and parliamentary insistence on control over taxation created irresolvable tensions that successive compromises temporarily managed, but never permanently resolved. James brought to the English throne political theories of divine right monarchy that he had developed during his reign as King of Scotland, theories that emphasized the sacred character of royal authority and the king's accountability to God alone rather than to earthly subjects or representative institutions, creating immediate conflicts with English parliamentary traditions that insisted on the principle established in Magna Carta that taxation required consent. The fiscal situation James inherited was already strained, as Elizabeth's war expenses had exhausted the Crown's financial reserves and accumulated substantial debts, while the fundamental structural problem remained that royal revenues from traditional sources, including Crown lands, customs duties, and feudal incidents, proved inadequate for the expanding responsibilities of early modern government, creating a gap that could only be filled through parliamentary taxation that members of Parliament were increasingly reluctant to grant without extracting concessions regarding royal policies and prerogatives. James's personal extravagance and his generosity towards Scottish favourites who had accompanied him to England created additional fiscal pressures as court expenditure increased substantially compared to Elizabeth's parsimonious management, while unsuccessful foreign policy initiatives, including plans for a Spanish marriage alliance, generated expenses without producing corresponding benefits or the parliamentary support necessary to fund ambitious diplomatic programs. The Parliament of 1604 refused to grant taxation on the scale James requested, and instead presented grievances regarding monopolies, impositions, and other aspects of royal fiscal policy, establishing patterns of conflict between Crown and Commons that would characterise the entire Stuart period as each side attempted to pressure the other into concessions regarding fundamental constitutional principles. The Crown's attempts to increase revenues without parliamentary consent through expansion of customs impositions on imports, exploitation of feudal incidents through aggressive investigation of land titles, revival of obsolete financial claims, and sale of titles and honours, all generated parliamentary opposition and legal challenges that escalated constitutional conflicts, while providing inadequate revenue to resolve the Crown's fiscal crisis. The addled Parliament of 1614 dissolved without passing any legislation or granting any taxation after weeks of disputes over impositions and monopolies, demonstrating the complete breakdown of fiscal cooperation between Crown and Parliament and forcing James to rely entirely on prerogative revenues and extraordinary expedients, including the notorious sale of peerages and baronetcies that debased the honours system while generating relatively modest revenue. The fiscal expedients of James's later years increasingly alienated important constituencies, including merchants who objected to monopolies that restricted trade, nobles who resented the sale of honours to wealthy merchants and lawyers who challenged the legality of impositions and other prerogative taxes, and members of Parliament who saw royal financial policies as unconstitutional usurpations that violated fundamental principles established in Magna Carta and confirmed by centuries of precedent. The accession of Charles I in 1625 brought to the throne a monarch even more committed to theories of divine right, and even less willing to accept parliamentary limitations on royal authority than his father, ensuring that the fiscal and constitutional conflicts that had characterized James's reign would intensify rather than moderate under the new king. Charles's immediate involvement in expensive foreign wars against both Spain and France created urgent revenue needs that required parliamentary cooperation, but his dissolution of Parliament in 1629, following disputes over taxation, and his criticism of the Duke of Buckingham, initiated the 11 years of personal rule, during which Charles governed without Parliament, attempted to finance government entirely through exploitation of prerogative revenues and revival of obsolete fiscal claims. The fiscal expedients of Charles's personal rule from 1629 to 1640 demonstrated both the theoretical extent of royal prerogative taxation powers and the practical limits of attempting to govern without parliamentary grants, as the king's agents systematically exploited every conceivable source of revenue that could be claimed as legitimate under existing law, while simultaneously creating widespread resentment that would explode into revolution once Parliament was recalled. The revival of forest laws and the imposition of fines on landowners whose properties lay within ancient forest boundaries that had not been enforced for centuries generated substantial revenue while creating intense opposition from affected gentry who viewed these prosecutions as arbitrary harassment designed solely to extort money rather than as legitimate enforcement of valid legal restrictions. The extension of ship money from coastal counties to the entire kingdom represented the most controversial fiscal measure of the personal rule, as this traditional levy for naval defence had historically applied only to maritime regions that benefited directly from naval protection. But Charles's extension of the tax to inland counties in 1635 and subsequent years asserted royal authority to impose national taxation without parliamentary consent by claiming that national defence constituted an emergency that justified extraordinary prerogative powers. The legal challenge to ship money, brought by John Hampden in 1637, attracted national attention, as it directly confronted the question of whether the king possessed authority to impose taxation without parliamentary favor. Consent in circumstances, he determined, constituted emergencies, with the judges eventually ruling narrowly in favour of the Crown, but with the closeness of the decision and the powerful dissenting opinions demonstrating significant legal scepticism about the king's claims. The widespread resistance to ship money collection in the late 1630s demonstrated the practical limits of prerogative taxation, as many subjects simply refused to pay, despite legal judgments in the Crown's favour, forcing increasingly coercive collection methods that further alienated populations and demonstrated that even technically legal taxation would prove difficult to enforce if it lacked political legitimacy and popular acceptance. The Scottish crisis that erupted in 1637, following Charles's attempts to impose Anglican liturgy on the Presbyterian Scottish Church, quickly escalated into military conflict that created fiscal demands the king could not meet from prerogative revenues, forcing him to recall Parliament in April 1640 after 11 years of personal rule, a decision that would prove fatal to royal absolutism and would initiate the constitutional conflicts that led to civil war. The short Parliament of April to May 1640 dissolved after only 3 weeks, when members refused to grant taxation until grievances from the personal rule had been addressed, demonstrating that Parliament would use its fiscal leverage to force constitutional concessions, and that the king's immediate military needs would not persuade Commons to abandon their insistence on addressing systemic issues regarding royal authority and subject rights. The continued Scottish military pressure and Charles's complete inability to finance resistance without parliamentary support forced the summoning of what became the Long Parliament in November 1640, an assembly that would sit with various interruptions until 1660 and would fundamentally transform English government through revolutionary legislation that dismantled the prerogative powers Charles had exploited during personal rule. The Long Parliament's early legislation addressed fiscal grievances systematically by abolishing ship money, declaring various other prerogative taxes illegal, eliminating the prerogative courts including Star Chamber that had enforced royal fiscal policies, and establishing parliamentary control over taxation through statutes that made parliamentary consent mandatory for any form of direct taxation, while also bringing customs duties under parliamentary supervision, rather than leaving them as prerogative revenues. The escalation of conflicts between Charles and Parliament over control of military forces and religious policy culminated in the outbreak of civil war in August 1642, with fiscal disputes regarding taxation authority playing central roles in the breakdown of relations, as Parliament's insistence on controlling revenues and Charles's refusal to accept limitations on royal prerogative made compromise impossible once mutual distrust had destroyed any possibility of cooperation. The English Civil War from 1642 to 1646 and its continuation through various phases until 1651 required unprecedented fiscal mobilization by both royalist and parliamentary forces, creating revolutionary taxation systems that would permanently transform English fiscal structures and establish precedents for more intensive governmental extraction of resources from society. The parliamentary regime that controlled London and the economically productive southeastern regions possessed substantial advantages in raising revenue through control of customs collection at major ports and ability to tax the wealthiest counties, enabling Parliament to develop systematic taxation mechanisms, including a monthly assessment that was essentially a direct tax on property, excise duties, on consumption goods that represented England's first general internal indirect taxation, and various other levies that generated revenues far exceeding anything the Stuart kings had accomplished through prerogative taxation. The monthly assessment functioned as a quota system by which each county received an assignment of the total amount Parliament needed to raise, with local committees responsible for apportioning the burden among individual taxpayers and collecting the assessed amounts, creating administrative structures that linked national fiscal planning with local implementation, and that proved remarkably effective at generating consistent revenue streams despite the ongoing warfare and economic disruption. The introduction of excise taxation in 1643 represented a revolutionary innovation in English fiscal policy, as these taxes on consumption of common commodities, including beer, ale, meat, and other basic goods, reached far more deeply into society than previous taxes that had fallen primarily on landowners and merchants, creating genuinely broad-based taxation that affected all social classes and generated substantial revenue, precisely because the tax base was so extensive. The administrative apparatus required for excise collection included networks of collectors, inspectors, and enforcement officers who monitored production and sale of taxed commodities, verified tax payments, investigated evasion, and prosecuted violators, creating bureaucratic structures that prefigured the more developed tax administration that would emerge after the Restoration. The royalist fiscal system operated under severe disadvantages, as Charles controlled less wealthy agricultural regions where taxation proved more difficult and generated less revenue, while his political need to avoid alienating potential supporters limited his ability to impose harsh fiscal measures, forcing reliance on voluntary contributions, plunder of enemy territories, and sales of honors and offices that generated immediate funds while creating long-term political problems. The self-denying Ordinance of 1645 and the creation of the new model army represented not only military reforms but also fiscal innovations, as the professionalization of parliamentary forces required systematic funding through the monthly assessment and excise revenues, creating for the first time in English history a permanent military establishment supported by regular taxation rather than by feudal levies or temporary forces raised for specific campaigns. The regicide of Charles I in January 1649 and the establishment of the Commonwealth created a revolutionary government that inherited and expanded the fiscal innovations developed during the Civil War, including continuation of the monthly assessment and excise duties, alongside various other taxes, and the liquidation of crown lands and properties that generated substantial short-term revenue, while eliminating a traditional basis of royal income. The fiscal burden imposed by the Commonwealth and Protectorate governments reached levels unprecedented in English history, as the maintenance of large military forces for campaigns in Ireland and Scotland, the naval wars against the Dutch, and the administrative costs of revolutionary government required revenues far exceeding what had been collected under the Stuart kings, forcing continued high taxation that created widespread resentment and contributed to the eventual restoration of the monarchy. The Major General's experiment of 1655 to 1656, during which England was divided into military districts, each governed by a Major General with broad powers, including fiscal authority, to impose special taxation on former royalists, demonstrated the extent to which revolutionary government was willing to employ discriminatory taxation as a weapon against political opponents, creating precedents that most Englishmen found deeply threatening, regardless of their political sympathies. The restoration of Charles II in 1660 appeared to restore traditional monarchy and promised a return to constitutional normality after the revolutionary upheavals of the interregnum. But the fiscal settlement that accompanied the restoration permanently incorporated many of the innovations developed during the Commonwealth period, while attempting to re-establish the principle that the king should ordinarily live of his own without requiring regular parliamentary taxation. The abolition of feudal tenures and the incidents associated with them represented one of the most significant constitutional changes of the Restoration settlement, as Parliament exchanged the Crown's theoretical rights to feudal revenues, including wardships, marriages, and various other payments, for a permanent grant of excise duties on beer, ale, and other beverages, creating a stable revenue source while eliminating obligations that had become increasingly burdensome and controversial during the preceding decades. The Restoration financial settlement attempted to provide Charles with annual revenues of approximately £1,200,000, an amount theoretically sufficient for peacetime government, while requiring parliamentary grants for military operations or other extraordinary expenses. But the actual yield of granted revenues consistently fell short of this target due to economic difficulties, inefficient collection, and over-optimistic projections regarding tax yields, leaving Charles chronically short of funds and frequently dependent on parliamentary taxation, despite the theoretical adequacy of his ordinary revenues. The development of more sophisticated fiscal administration during Charles's reign saw the gradual professionalization of revenue collection through the Treasury and the revenue boards, including the Customs and Excise establishments, which developed specialized expertise and systematic procedures that improved collection efficiency while reducing the corruption and inefficiency that had characterized earlier fiscal administration. The creation of the Treasury Commission in 1667 and its evolution into a permanent governmental institution marked an important step in the development of modern fiscal management, as the Treasury assumed central coordinating authority over revenue collection and expenditure, developing the capacity for systematic financial planning and management that would enable the enormous fiscal expansion required for the wars of the 18th century. Charles's secret financial dependence on Louis XIV of France through subsidy payments that enabled him to avoid parliamentary taxation while pursuing pro-French foreign policies created constitutional crises. When these arrangements became public knowledge, demonstrating how fiscal leverage could affect not only domestic policy, but also foreign relations and national security. The exclusion crisis of 1678 to 1681 involved parliamentary attempts to exclude Charles's Catholic brother James from the succession, with fiscal dimensions, including parliamentary threats to withhold taxation unless Charles accepted exclusion, and Charles's ability to resist these pressures, partly through his French subsidies and through economy measures that enabled him to govern during his final years without summoning Parliament. The accession of James II in 1685 brought to the throne a monarch whose Catholicism created profound political problems, but whose immediate fiscal position proved reasonably strong, as Parliament granted him the customs and excise revenues for life. Following tradition, providing revenues that might have been adequate for peacetime government if James had not alienated virtually every significant political interest through his religious policies. James's attempts to employ fiscal patronage to build political support for repealing the anti-Catholic Test Acts and penal laws included offers of tax exemptions and favourable customs arrangements to corporations and merchants who supported his policies, demonstrating how taxation policy could be manipulated to reward supporters and punish opponents in ways that transcended simple revenue generation. The Glorious Revolution of 1688, that replaced James with his daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange, resulted from multiple causes, but fiscal considerations played important roles, as William's need for English financial support for his ongoing struggle against Louis XIV made him willing to accept parliamentary conditions that James had rejected, while the political classes supporting the revolution sought to establish permanent parliamentary control over royal finances that would prevent any future monarch from governing without Parliament, as Charles II had done during his final years. The revolutionary financial settlement following 1688 established constitutional principles and institutional frameworks that would shape English and subsequently British fiscal development for centuries, transforming the monarchy into a constitutional institution that governed in partnership with Parliament under arrangements that made parliamentary control of taxation and royal dependence on parliamentary grants permanent features of the fastened British constitutional system. The Bill of Rights of 1689 codified these principles by explicitly declaring illegal the levying of taxes without parliamentary consent, establishing definitively that the prerogative taxation powers that Stuart kings had claimed possessed no legal validity, and that all forms of taxation required authorization through parliamentary legislation. The financial settlement granted William and Mary customs and excise revenues for their lives following tradition, but Parliament quickly established that grants would be reviewed regularly and could be modified or withheld if royal conduct warranted such action, creating leverage that ensured monarchs would respect parliamentary prerogatives and constitutional limitations. The transformation of England's fiscal capabilities during William's reign from 1689 to 1702 resulted primarily from the enormous costs of participation in the 9 Years' War against France from 1689 to 1697, a conflict that required military expenditure on scales unprecedented in English history, and that could only be financed through revolutionary expansions in taxation and the development of systematic governmental borrowing that created the permanent national debt. The land tax, established in 1692, replaced earlier property taxes with a systematic annual levy assessed at 4 shillings in the pound on the annual value of land and other property, creating a revenue source that would provide the foundation for war finance throughout the 18th century, and that represented the first truly modern form of direct taxation with regular assessments, systematic collection procedures, and substantial yields. The land tax generated approximately £2 million annually when assessed at the 4 shilling rate, roughly double the total ordinary revenues that had been considered adequate for peacetime government during the Restoration, demonstrating the extent to which 18th century fiscal capacity exceeded earlier capabilities and enabling the maintenance of military forces far larger than previous English governments had sustained. The expansion of excise taxation during the 1690s added new commodities to the list of taxed goods and increased rates on existing excises, with the salt tax proving particularly unpopular due to its regressive impact on poor consumers, who spent disproportionate shares of their incomes on this essential commodity, but with the political necessity of war finance, overriding objections to specific taxes that might have been rejected during peacetime. The customs revenue system underwent substantial expansion and reform during this period. As rates increased, administrative procedures improved, and enforcement mechanisms strengthened, though smuggling remained a persistent problem that reduced actual collections below theoretical yields and created ongoing challenges for revenue authorities. The most revolutionary fiscal innovation of William's reign involved the development of systematic governmental borrowing through the creation of the Bank of England in 1694 and the establishment of long-term, funded debt by which the government could borrow money through selling securities that paid regular interest and that could be traded in secondary markets, creating liquid assets that wealthy individuals and institutions would purchase as investments. The foundation of the Bank of England represented a partnership between government and private finance, by which a group of wealthy investors lent £1,200,000 to the government in exchange for a charter, establishing them as a corporation with banking privileges, including the right to issue banknotes, creating an institution that would serve as the government's banker and would play central roles in managing the national debt and facilitating governmental borrowing for the next 3 centuries. The development of funded debt represented a crucial innovation that enabled governments to spend far beyond annual tax revenues by borrowing against future income, with the debt service paid from regular taxation, creating a permanent burden, but also enabling immediate mobilization of resources that would have been impossible if governments were limited to current tax revenues. The fiscal revolution of the 1690s permanently transformed English state capacity by creating mechanisms that could generate and deploy financial resources on scales that enabled England to compete militarily and diplomatically with much larger continental powers, including France, whose population was approximately 3 times England's, but whose less developed fiscal and financial systems limited their effective mobilization of resources. The political implications of these fiscal innovations included the strengthening of parliamentary power, as the national debt created institutional interests in maintaining parliamentary government, since investors in government securities required confidence that interest payments would continue and that representative institutions would prevent royal repudiation of debts, effectively giving the financial classes powerful stakes in preserving the constitutional settlement and parliamentary control over taxation. The 18th century witnessed the maturation of the fiscal military state that the financial revolution had created, as successive wars, including the War of Spanish Succession, the War of Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, and the American Revolutionary War, required enormous expenditures that drove the expansion of both taxation and national debt to levels that would have been unimaginable in previous centuries. The land tax remained the single most important source of government revenue throughout the first half of the 18th century, regularly assessed at 4 shillings in the pound during wartime and reduced to lower rates during peacetime intervals, with the total annual yield reaching approximately £2 million and providing the foundation for war finance, while the funded debt enabled short-term borrowing that could be serviced from land tax revenues. The political economy of the land tax created interesting distributional consequences, as the tax fell primarily on agricultural land and thus burdened landed gentry and aristocracy, who possessed political power, but whose wealth derived from traditional sources, while commercial and financial wealth that increasingly dominated the economy faced lighter relative tax burdens, creating tensions that would influence political debates about taxation throughout the century. The expansion of excise taxation during the early 18th century reflected governmental needs for additional revenue that could supplement the land tax, with new excises imposed on various commodities, including candles, leather, soap, paper, and other goods of common consumption, creating a complex web of internal indirect taxes that required substantial administrative apparatus to collect, and that generated persistent popular resentment due to their impact on living costs and the intrusive inspection powers that excise collectors exercised. Walpole's failed attempt to impose a general excise on wine and tobacco in 1733 demonstrated the political limits of excise expansion, as the proposal generated enormous public opposition based on fears about the extension of excise administration and concerns about the precedent of creating a general system of internal indirect taxation, forcing Walpole to withdraw the scheme and establishing that major innovations in indirect taxation would face significant political obstacles, even when fiscal necessity appeared to justify them. The customs duties on imported goods generated substantial revenue throughout the 18th century, with rates varying considerably across different commodities, and with the system's complexity creating opportunities for evasion through smuggling that became a major economic activity, particularly in coastal regions where enforcement proved difficult, and local populations often sympathized with smugglers rather than revenue officers. The development of free ports and other special customs arrangements during the 18th century reflected both mercantilist economic theories that sought to promote English commercial advantages and practical recognition that excessively high duties encouraged smuggling and reduced actual revenue collection, leading to periodic reforms that lowered rates on specific commodities to levels that made legal importation more attractive than smuggling while still generating acceptable revenue. The 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763 created fiscal pressures that drove both taxation and borrowing to unprecedented levels, with the national debt more than doubling from approximately £72 million to approximately £132 million, while annual tax revenues increased from approximately £8 million to approximately £12 million, demonstrating the extent to which warfare drove fiscal expansion and created the large permanent debt that would characterize British public finances thereafter. The acquisition of vast new territories in North America and India following British victories in the 7 Years' War created both opportunities and obligations that would influence fiscal policy, as the costs of defending and administering these territories exceeded the revenues they generated, contributing to fiscal pressures that influenced the decision to impose new taxes on American colonies, decisions that would ultimately provoke rebellion and the loss of the 13 colonies. The Stamp Act of 1765 represented the first attempt by Parliament to impose direct internal taxation on American colonies, requiring that various legal documents, newspapers, and other printed materials bear revenue stamps purchased from royal officials, creating a relatively modest tax burden, but violating what colonists considered their constitutional rights to be taxed only by their own representative assemblies, rather than by a parliament in which they were not represented. The colonial resistance to the Stamp Act, including riots, boycotts of British goods, and systematic refusal to comply with the law, forced its repeal in 1766. But Parliament simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its authority to legislate for colonies in all cases whatsoever, maintaining the constitutional principle while retreating from its specific application in the face of colonial resistance. The subsequent attempts to tax American colonies through the Townshend Duties of 1767, the Tea Act of 1773, and other measures continued the cycle of imperial taxation, followed by colonial resistance, culminating in the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War in 1775 and the permanent loss of the 13 colonies following their successful rebellion. The fiscal consequences of the American Revolution for Britain included the enormous costs of prosecuting an unsuccessful war that added approximately £100 million to the national debt, the loss of tax revenues and commercial advantages from the American colonies, and the demonstration that imperial taxation could provoke resistance sufficient to break apart the empire, lessons that would influence British colonial fiscal policy throughout the 19th century. The fiscal pressures created by American war expenses drove expansion of taxation in Britain, including increases in land tax rates, extension of excise duties to additional commodities, and introduction of new taxes, including various assessed taxes on windows, servants, horses, and other indicators of wealth that attempted to reach taxpayers who successfully minimized their exposure to existing taxes. The window tax, introduced in 1696, but significantly expanded during the 18th century, created perverse incentives as property owners bricked up windows to avoid taxation, leading to darker, less healthy buildings while reducing the tax yield below projections, demonstrating how poorly designed taxes could produce unintended consequences that undermined both their revenue potential and their economic efficiency. The assessed taxes on various forms of consumption and on indicators of wealth represented attempts to develop alternatives to the land tax that would spread tax burdens more broadly across society. But the administrative difficulties of accurate assessment and the political resistance from affected groups limited both the revenue generated and the scope of these taxes, maintaining the fiscal system's dependence on the combination of land tax, customs duties, and excise taxes that had characterized war finance since the 1690s. William Pitt the Younger's tenure as Prime Minister from 1783 to 1801, and again from 1804 to 1806, witnessed significant fiscal reforms, including the Commutation Act of 1784, which dramatically reduced tea duties while compensating with increased window taxes, effectively shifting tax burden from customs to direct taxation, while simultaneously reducing smuggling by making legal tea purchase more economically attractive than illicit acquisition. Pitt's consolidation of various customs and excise duties into the Consolidated Fund in 1787 represented an important administrative reform that simplified the complex web of specific revenue assignments that had accumulated over decades, and that made tracking of governmental receipts and expenditures more transparent, though the fundamental structures of taxation remained unchanged. The management of the national debt during the later 18th century required increasingly sophisticated financial operations, including regular refinancing of existing debt at lower interest rates when market conditions allowed, creation of sinking funds theoretically intended to retire debt through setting aside portions of current revenues, though in practice these funds were often raided for other purposes, and development of new borrowing instruments that could attract investment from increasingly diverse groups of potential creditors. The political economy debates of the later 18th century increasingly focused on questions of taxation, incidence, and economic efficiency, with writers, including Adam Smith, analyzing how different forms of taxation affected economic behavior and arguing that tax systems should be evaluated not only for their revenue generation, but also for their impacts on economic growth, distribution of burdens across society. Smith's Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, articulated principles of sound taxation, including equity, certainty, convenience, and economy, that would influence subsequent debates about tax policy, though his specific recommendations regarding land taxes and opposition to customs duties reflected theoretical commitments that governments found difficult to implement given practical revenue needs and political constraints. The French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars from 1793 to 1815 created fiscal demands that exceeded anything Britain had previously experienced, forcing innovations in both taxation and borrowing that would permanently transform British fiscal capacity and establish new precedents for the relationship between government and economy during periods of national emergency. The initial phases of the war through the 1790s were financed primarily through expansion of existing taxes and substantial increases in borrowing, with the national debt growing from approximately £240 million in 1793 to approximately £456 million by 1802, reflecting the enormous costs of financing coalition warfare against revolutionary France, while maintaining naval supremacy and supporting subsidies to continental allies. The suspension of gold convertibility in 1797, when the Bank of England ceased redeeming its notes for gold coin following financial panic and fears of French invasion, represented a crucial moment in British monetary history, as it effectively placed Britain on a paper currency standard for the duration of the wars, enabling more flexible monetary policy, but also contributing to inflation that eroded the real value of fixed incomes and created social tensions. The introduction of the income tax by Pitt in 1799 represented the most revolutionary fiscal innovation in British history since the financial revolution a century earlier, establishing for the first time systematic taxation of income, regardless of its source, and creating administrative machinery capable of monitoring and taxing the growing commercial and professional incomes that had become increasingly important in Britain's evolving economy. Pitt's initial income tax imposed rates rising from 2 pence in the pound on incomes between £60 and £200 annually to 2 shillings in the pound, effectively 10%, on incomes exceeding £200, creating a graduated rate structure that attempted to distribute burdens according to ability to pay, while generating substantial revenue projected at approximately £10 million annually, roughly equivalent to the entire land tax yield. The administrative challenges of income tax collection were formidable, as taxpayers had no tradition of reporting their incomes to governmental authorities, and substantial evasion proved inevitable, particularly among commercial and professional classes whose incomes were less visible than landed revenues. But the tax nevertheless generated substantial revenue and demonstrated that direct taxation of income was feasible if political circumstances created sufficient necessity to overcome resistance and administrative obstacles. The initial income tax was repealed following the Peace of Amiens in 1802, but its revival in 1803 when war resumed, and its continuation through the remainder of the Napoleonic Wars, established precedents and administrative capabilities that would enable its permanent reintroduction in the 1840s, despite deep ideological objections to systematic governmental oversight of private incomes. The expansion of indirect taxation during the Napoleonic Wars saw significant increases in customs and excise duties, alongside the introduction of new taxes on various commodities and activities, creating a tax system of extraordinary complexity and reach that penetrated virtually every aspect of economic life, and that generated revenues approaching £100 million annually by the war's conclusion, roughly 10 times the tax revenues that had been collected at the beginning of the 18th century. The political economy of war finance created interesting distributional patterns as the combination of income tax, expanded indirect taxes, and substantial borrowing distributed costs across different segments of society, with income taxpayers bearing direct burdens proportional to their incomes, consumers paying through higher prices resulting from excise duties, and future generations obligated to service the national debt that had reached approximately £800 million by 1815, creating debt service costs that would absorb approximately one-half of government revenues during the immediate post-war decades. The social and political consequences of heavy wartime taxation included both short-term hardships that contributed to periodic unrest and food riots when harvest failures, combined with high food prices, resulting partly from taxation, and longer-term transformations in state capacity and in relationships between government and citizens, as the administrative apparatus required for income tax collection created unprecedented governmental knowledge of private economic activities. The post-war period following Waterloo witnessed intense debates about whether wartime taxation levels should be maintained or reduced, with particular controversy surrounding the income tax, which Parliament allowed to lapse in 1816. Despite governmental arguments that continued, high revenue would be necessary to service the national debt and maintain military establishments adequate for Britain's global responsibilities. The abolition of the income tax in 1816 reflected both deep-seated ideological objections to systematic governmental surveillance of private incomes and political pressures from middle-class taxpayers who had borne the direct burden and who demanded relief once the immediate military emergency had passed. Though the decision complicated post-war fiscal management by eliminating revenues that would have enabled faster debt reduction or maintenance of larger military forces without requiring increased indirect taxation, the Corn Laws that maintained high tariffs on grain imports represented another controversial aspect of post-war fiscal policy, as these duties generated customs revenue while also protecting domestic agricultural interests from foreign competition, creating a policy that served both fiscal and economic protectionist objectives, but that raised food prices and burdened working-class consumers who spent large portions of their incomes on bread and other grain products. The campaign for Corn Law repeal that emerged during the 1820s and 1830s reflected both economic arguments about the benefits of free trade and political arguments about the unfairness of a tax system that protected landed interests while burdening industrial workers, though the fiscal dimension remained important, as customs revenues from grain and other foodstuffs represented significant portions of total governmental receipts, and their elimination would require either reduced expenditure or increased taxation from other sources. The gradual liberalisation of British trade policy during the 1820s, under the leadership of William Huskisson, involved significant reductions in customs duties on various commodities, including elimination of many prohibitive tariffs that had blocked imports entirely, replacement of complex webs of specific duties with simpler ad valorem rates, and generally movement toward freer trade that reflected both economic theory developed by classical political economists and practical recognition that excessive duties encouraged smuggling and reduced actual revenue collection. The fiscal reforms of the 1820s also addressed various inefficiencies and anachronisms in the tax system, including consolidation of multiple customs and excise duties, elimination of some particularly regressive or administratively burdensome taxes, and improvements in revenue administration that reduced corruption and increased collection efficiency, though these reforms remained incremental rather than revolutionary and left intact the fundamental structures of British fiscal policy. The resumption of gold convertibility in 1821 and the return to the gold standard represented important financial developments that would influence fiscal policy throughout the 19th century by creating commitments to monetary stability that limited governmental ability to use inflationary finance and that required maintaining sufficient revenues to service debt obligations and maintain confidence in government securities. The political reform crisis of the early 1830s that culminated in the Great Reform Act of 1832 had important fiscal dimensions, as middle-class demands for political representation were motivated partly by resentment of a tax system that middle-class taxpayers believed unfairly burdened them, while protecting aristocratic interests through policies like the Corn Laws, creating linkages between fiscal grievances and demands for constitutional reform that echoed earlier conflicts over taxation and representation. The reintroduction of income tax by Peel in 1842, initially as a temporary measure to address budget deficits and to enable reductions in customs and excise duties that were hampering trade, represented a crucial turning point in British fiscal history, as the tax would become permanent despite continued protests and would eventually evolve into the most important single source of government revenue. Peel's income tax was initially assessed at 7 pence in the pound, substantially lower than rates during the Napoleonic Wars, and applied to incomes exceeding £150 annually, exempting working-class incomes while taxing middle and upper-class earnings, creating a progressive element in the tax system, though without the sophisticated graduated rate structure that would develop later. The administrative procedures for income tax collection evolved considerably from the Napoleonic War precedents, with the development of withholding at source for certain types of income, including government salaries and interest payments, creating systems that reduced evasion while minimizing the administrative burden on individual taxpayers who could have their tax obligations satisfied through automatic deductions rather than requiring active reporting and payment. The repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 represented perhaps the most significant fiscal and economic policy change of the 19th century, as Peel's decision to eliminate protective grain tariffs, despite opposition from his own Conservative Party, reflected both humanitarian concerns during the Irish famine and commitment to free trade principles that would guide British Party commercial policy for the remainder of the century, though the immediate revenue loss from eliminated grain duties was partially offset by expanded income tax revenues that the 1842 reintroduction had made available. The mid-Victorian period from the 1850s through the 1870s witnessed the triumph of free trade ideology in British fiscal policy, with Chancellor of the Exchequer William Gladstone systematically reducing or eliminating customs and excise duties on numerous commodities, while maintaining and occasionally increasing income tax to compensate for lost revenue, creating a fiscal system that relied much less heavily on indirect taxation than had characterized earlier periods, and that shifted tax burdens more directly onto middle and upper-class incomes. Gladstone's budget of 1853 represented the fullest articulation of mid-Victorian fiscal liberalism, proposing phased elimination of income tax by 1860, while simultaneously reforming indirect taxation to remove duties that restricted trade or that fell heavily on working-class consumption. though the Crimean War intervened and forced abandonment of the income tax elimination schedule, ensuring the tax's permanence despite Gladstone's philosophical objections to it. The Crimean War from 1854 to 1856 demonstrated that even a limited conflict involving relatively small British land forces alongside larger Allied armies could create fiscal pressures requiring tax increases, with income tax rates rising to 16 pence in the pound and various indirect taxes being increased or reimposed, though the scale of fiscal mobilization remained far below what the Napoleonic Wars had required, and the revenue system proved adequate to fund British participation without creating economic crisis or requiring suspension of gold convertibility. The introduction of succession duties in 1853 extended death duties beyond real property to include personal property and settled estates that had previously escaped taxation when transferred between generations, creating more equitable treatment of different forms of wealth and generating additional revenue that would become increasingly important as Britain's economy evolved and personal property comprised growing portions of total wealth. The administrative developments of the mid-Victorian period included increasing professionalisation of the revenue services with the creation of a dedicated civil service recruited through competitive examination rather than patronage, development of systematic training programs for revenue officers, and implementation of improved accounting and auditing procedures that reduced corruption while increasing efficiency. The limited franchise throughout most of the 19th century meant that taxation policy was determined by Parliament representing relatively narrow segments of society, with working-class populations who bore substantial portions of indirect tax burdens, lacking direct political representation, until the franchise extensions of 1867 and 1884 gradually expanded voting rights and created political pressures for more progressive taxation that would favour working-class interests. The development of progressive taxation principles during the late 19th century reflected both practical political pressures from newly enfranchised working-class voters and intellectual currents, including utilitarian philosophy, and early socialist thought that argued taxation should be based on ability to pay, and that wealthy taxpayers should bear proportionally greater burdens due to the diminishing marginal utility of income. The introduction of graduated rates in death duties during the 1894 budget represented an important innovation by which higher value estates faced higher percentage rates rather than the flat percentage that had previously applied, creating precedent for systematic graduation that would eventually extend to income taxation and create the steeply progressive rate structures characteristic of 20th century taxation. The fiscal challenges of the late 19th and early 20th centuries increasingly involved funding the expanding governmental responsibilities that emerged from demands for social reform, imperial defence requirements, and the naval race with Germany that created enormous pressure for increased government expenditure that existing revenue sources struggled to support. The People's Budget of 1909, introduced by Chancellor of the Exchequer David Lloyd George, represented one of the most revolutionary budgets in British history, proposing substantial increases in income tax rates, particularly for higher incomes, introduction of a super tax on incomes exceeding £3,000 that created a surtax system, new land value taxes, and increased death duties, generating fierce opposition from the House of Lords that precipitated a constitutional crisis, ultimately resolved by the Parliament Act of 1911 that eliminated the Lords' ability to reject money bills. The constitutional crisis surrounding the People's Budget established definitively that the House of Commons possessed exclusive authority over taxation and that the unelected Lords could not block fiscal legislation passed by the Umans, elected chamber, creating constitutional arrangements that would govern British fiscal policy thereafter, and that ensured that taxation policy would reflect the preferences of elected representatives, subject to democratic accountability, rather than aristocratic privilege. The land value taxation proposals in the 1909 budget ultimately proved administratively unworkable and generated far less revenue than projected, leading to their eventual abandonment. But the income tax and super tax increases succeeded in generating substantial new revenues that funded both increased social expenditure, including old age pensions introduced in 1908, and expanded naval construction programs that attempted to maintain British superiority over the growing German fleet. The outbreak of World War I in August 1914 created fiscal demands that dwarfed anything Britain had previously experienced, as the war's industrial character and Britain's role in financing not only its own massive military expansion, but also providing credits to allies, created expenditure levels reaching approximately £2 billion annually by 1917, roughly 10 times pre-war governmental spending. The financing of World War I required revolutionary expansion of taxation, including dramatic increases in income tax rates that reached 6 shillings in the pound for highest incomes by war's end, introduction of an excess profits tax on businesses earning unusually high returns from war contracts and wartime economic conditions, substantial increases in customs and excise duties, and various other levies. But even these unprecedented tax increases covered only approximately 1/3 of war costs, with the remainder financed through borrowing that increased the national debt from approximately £650 million in 1914 to approximately £7,800 million. By 1919, the introduction of pay-as-you-earn, withholding for wage income during World War II, represented an administrative revolution that solved long-standing problems of income tax collection from wage earners by requiring employers to withhold tax from wages before payment to workers, creating a system that ensured compliance while minimizing administrative burden on individual taxpayers, though raising concerns about governmental power to extract taxes directly from earnings before taxpayers received their income. The development of comprehensive social insurance during the 1940s, through the implementation of the Beveridge Report's recommendations, created new forms of compulsory contributions that functioned economically as taxes, though legally structured as insurance premiums, generating revenues dedicated to specific social programs including unemployment benefits, health insurance, and retirement pensions that would become major components of government expenditure and that would require continuing revenue increases to maintain as populations aged and program costs expanded. The post-war taxation system that emerged from these wartime innovations created a fiscal structure characterized by very high marginal rates on upper incomes, with the top rate reaching 97.5% on investment income during the 1970s. Comprehensive indirect taxation through purchase, tax and later value-added tax, substantial national insurance contributions, and various other levies that combined to create total tax burdens approaching 40% of national income, levels that would have been unimaginable in previous centuries, but that reflected the expanded role of government in providing social services, maintaining welfare state programs, and funding defense commitments during the Cold War. The transformation of British taxation during the final decades of the 20th century reflected both continuity with established patterns and revolutionary changes driven by economic globalization, ideological shifts toward market-oriented policies, technological innovations that transformed both economic activity and administrative capabilities, and evolving conceptions of the proper scope and methods of governmental revenue collection in increasingly complex and internationalized economies. The election of Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government in 1979 initiated a period of fundamental reassessment of British taxation policy, as the new administration brought to power ideological commitments to reducing the role of government in the economy, lowering tax rates, particularly on higher incomes and capital to encourage enterprise and investment, and shifting the balance of taxation from direct to indirect sources in ways that reversed many of the progressive redistributive tendencies that had characterized mid-20th century fiscal policy. The initial budgets of the Thatcher government implemented dramatic reductions in income tax rates, with the top marginal rate reduced from 83% on earned income and 98% on investment income to 60% immediately in the June 1979 budget, representing the most significant income tax reduction in modern British history, and reflecting commitments to supply-side economic theories that argued lower marginal rates would stimulate economic activity and ultimately generate greater revenue through expanded economic growth, even at lower rates. The simultaneous increase in value-added tax from 8% to 15% in the same budget demonstrated the government's intention to shift the tax burden from direct to indirect taxation, creating a fiscal structure that theoretically encouraged work and investment by reducing penalties on earning and saving, while raising revenue through consumption taxes that fell more broadly across society regardless of income levels. The economic consequences of these initial tax changes proved complex and controversial, as the severe recession of 1980 to 1981 saw unemployment rise dramatically, while manufacturing industries, particularly in northern England and Scotland, experienced devastating contractions, creating social costs that critics attributed partly to fiscal policies that withdrew governmental support from struggling industries and regions, while reducing progressive taxation that had previously provided some income redistribution. The revenue effects of the 1979 tax changes also diverged from supply-side predictions, as income tax revenues initially declined substantially, while VAT increases generated the additional revenue necessary to maintain government spending, demonstrating that behavioral responses to tax changes proved less dramatic than optimistic supply-side theorists had projected, and that tax rate reductions did not automatically produce sufficient economic growth to offset direct revenue losses. The continuing evolution of income taxation through the 1980s saw further rate reductions, including the dramatic cut in the top rate from 60% to 40% in the 1988 budget, creating a tax structure in which the highest earners faced the same marginal rate as middle-income taxpayers earning above the basic rate threshold, effectively eliminating the principle of steeply progressive taxation that had characterized British fiscal policy since the early 20th century. The 1988 budget also reduced the basic rate of income tax from 27% to 25%, creating a simplified two-rate structure that represented a fundamental break from the multiple bracket graduated rate systems that had evolved during the 20th century, and that reflected ideological commitments to flatter tax structures that treated different income levels more uniformly. The political economy of these income tax reductions created significant distributional consequences, as the primary beneficiaries were higher income taxpayers who experienced dramatic reductions in their tax liabilities both in absolute terms and as percentages of income, while working-class households that paid little income tax but that bore substantial VAT burdens on consumption experienced net increases in their overall tax obligations when direct and indirect taxes were considered together, contributing to widening income inequality that characterized the Thatcher era and that created lasting political controversies about the fairness and social consequences of tax policy choices. The poll tax disaster of 1989 to 1991 represented perhaps the most spectacular failure of taxation policy in modern British history, demonstrating how technically rational reforms that violated deeply held principles of fiscal fairness and ability to pay could generate political resistance sufficient to destroy governmental authority and force policy reversals, despite initial governmental determination to persist with unpopular measures. The community charge, officially termed but universally known as the poll tax, replaced the domestic rates system that had funded local government through property taxes with a flat per capita charge, assessed equally on all adults, regardless of income, property ownership, or economic circumstances, creating a tax structure that violated the progressive principles that had come to be seen as fundamental requirements of legitimate taxation in democratic societies. The intellectual rationale for the poll tax rested on arguments about accountability and local democratic governance, with advocates arguing that property taxes severed the connection between those who voted for local governmental spending and those who paid for it, since many voters lived in rented accommodation and did not directly pay rates, while a universal per capita charge would make all voters bear the costs of local government decisions, and therefore create incentives for more responsible voting behaviour and restrained local spending. The practical implementation of the poll tax in Scotland in 1989 and in England and Wales in 1990 immediately generated enormous resistance, as millions of people discovered they would pay substantially more under the new system than they had paid in rates or in subsidies toward rates for low-income tenants, with particularly severe impacts on large low-income families who faced multiple poll tax bills while previously having paid nothing or very little. The administrative challenges of implementing the poll tax proved formidable as local authorities struggled to register all adult residents, track population movements, and collect the assessed charges from populations that included substantial numbers of people with no history of direct tax payment and limited capacity to pay the required amounts, leading to widespread non-payment that reached approximately 30% in some areas, and that created local government funding crises, as anticipated revenues failed to materialize. The political crisis surrounding the poll tax culminated in large-scale protests, including the Trafalgar Square riots of March 31, 1990, organized civil disobedience campaigns that encouraged mass non-payment, and conservative parliamentary revolts as MPs representing marginal constituencies recognized that the poll tax had become politically toxic and threatened their electoral prospects, ultimately contributing to Margaret Thatcher's resignation in November 1990 and immediate governmental commitment to abolish the poll tax and replace it with a new system. The introduction of the council tax in 1993 represented a return to property-based local taxation, though with significant modifications from the previous rate system, including a banded structure that grouped properties into categories based on capital values rather than rental values, provisions for discounts and exemptions that provided some progressivity and protection for low-income households, and caps on increases that limited local governmental autonomy but that addressed concerns about uncontrolled local spending, driving up tax bills. The poll tax episode's broader lessons for taxation policy included powerful demonstrations that technical economic efficiency arguments could not overcome deeply held convictions about tax fairness, and that attempts to implement regressive taxation in democratic societies with universal suffrage would generate resistance that could destroy governmental legitimacy, regardless of whatever theoretical advantages such systems might possess in terms of administrative simplicity or accountability mechanisms. The political damage from the poll tax extended beyond the immediate policy failure to undermine conservative credibility on economic management and to create lasting associations between conservative taxation policy and unfairness that would influence electoral politics for decades, demonstrating how catastrophic policy failures could create political legacies that persisted long after the specific failed policies had been abandoned and replaced. The evolution of corporate taxation during the late 20th century reflected broader transformations in the global economy as increasing capital mobility, the growth of multinational enterprises operating across multiple tax jurisdictions, and international tax competition created challenges for maintaining effective taxation of business income while avoiding driving investment and employment to lower tax jurisdictions. The reduction of the corporate tax rate from 52% in 1979 to 33% by 1991 represented part of a broader international trend toward lower statutory corporate rates, as governments across developed economies recognized that maintaining significantly higher rates than competitor nations risked losing mobile capital investment, while not necessarily generating corresponding revenue increases if businesses successfully shifted profits to lower tax jurisdictions through transfer pricing and other international tax planning strategies. The introduction of advanced corporation tax in 1973 and its subsequent modifications created complex interactions between corporate and personal taxation, as the system attempted to provide relief from the double taxation that occurred when corporate profits were taxed at the entity level, and then dividends from those profits were taxed again as personal income to shareholders, though the mechanics of the Act system created distortions and compliance burdens that would eventually lead to its abolition in 1999. The development of special tax regimes for North Sea oil and gas extraction during the 1970s and 1980s created additional layers of complexity in corporate taxation as governments attempted to capture substantial portions of the economic rents generated by hydrocarbon exploitation through special petroleum revenue taxes that supplemented ordinary corporate taxation, with rates and structures varying over time in response to oil price fluctuations and political pressures, from both oil companies seeking lower tax burdens and populations demanding greater public capture of natural resource wealth. The taxation of financial services presented particular challenges as the City of London's importance to the British economy grew during the 1980s and subsequent decades, creating tensions between desires to tax the substantial profits generated by financial institutions and concerns about maintaining London's competitiveness against rival financial centres, including New York, Frankfurt, and Singapore, that competed to attract financial business through favourable regulatory and tax environments. The abolition of advance corporation tax in 1999 under Chancellor Gordon Brown represented significant reform that simplified the corporate tax system and eliminated distortions that had favoured distribution, dividends over retention of earnings. Though the change created complications for pension funds and other institutional investors that had benefited from ACT credits and that faced effectively higher taxation of dividend income following the reform. The introduction of controlled foreign company rules and other anti-avoidance provisions during this period demonstrated governmental recognition that international tax planning by multinational enterprises created substantial revenue losses, and that effective corporate taxation required sophisticated rules preventing artificial profit shifting to low-tax jurisdictions. Though the technical complexity of these provisions and the resources available to large corporations for tax planning meant that avoidance remained widespread, and that actual effective corporate tax rates paid by many large multinationals fell substantially below statutory rates. The debate about corporate tax competition and whether governments should attempt to maintain relatively high corporate taxes or instead participate in competitive rate reductions to attract investment reflected broader controversies about globalization's implications for national tax policy autonomy, with arguments that tax competition constrained governmental fiscal capacity and forced reductions in business taxation that necessitated higher taxes on less mobile factors, including labor and consumption, while defenders of lower corporate rates argued that competition improved efficiency by limiting governmental ability to impose excessive tax burdens that reduced economic growth and overall prosperity. The expansion of tax credits during the late 1990s and early 2000s represented a significant innovation in using the tax system to deliver social benefits and to supplement low wages, as Working Families Tax Credit, introduced in 1999, and its successor tax credits, created refundable credits that provided payments to low-income working families that exceeded their tax liabilities, effectively using tax administration to deliver what were economically transfer payments, though structured as tax reductions or refunds. The intellectual foundations of tax credits rested on arguments that subsidizing work through supplementing low wages would provide better incentives for employment than traditional welfare benefits that created poverty traps by reducing or eliminating benefits when recipients found work, while the use of tax administration to deliver benefits would reduce stigma associated with welfare receipt and would leverage existing administrative capabilities rather than requiring separate benefit bureaucracies. The practical implementation of tax credits proved considerably more complex than anticipated, as the systems required detailed information about family circumstances, including income, household composition, and childcare costs that changed frequently and that created substantial administrative burdens for both claimants and tax authorities, while payment errors and overpayments that subsequently had to be recovered created hardship for recipients who had spent money they believed was theirs, but that tax authorities later determined had been paid in error. The fiscal impact of tax credits proved substantial, as expenditure grew to approximately £30 billion annually by the mid-2000s, representing a significant expansion in governmental redistribution delivered through tax administration rather than through traditional spending programs. Though critics argued that tax credits effectively subsidized low-wage employers who could pay below subsistence wages, secure in knowledge that governmental tax credits would supplement their workers' incomes to minimally adequate levels. The evolution of tax credits into universal credit during the 2010s represented attempts to further integrate tax and benefit systems while simplifying the complex array of overlapping programs that had developed. Though universal credit implementation encountered severe difficulties, including IT system failures, payment delays that created hardship for recipients, and political controversies about benefit levels and conditionality requirements that demonstrated continuing challenges in designing effective systems for delivering income support to low-income populations. The relationship between tax policy and welfare policy became increasingly blurred through these developments, as tax administration took on functions traditionally performed by separate welfare bureaucracies, creating systems in which the same governmental institutions simultaneously extracted taxes from some populations while delivering transfer payments to others, with the net fiscal position of many households depending on complex interactions between tax liabilities, tax credits, and other benefits that few recipients fully understood, and that created substantial administrative complexity. The technological transformation of tax administration during the late 20th and early 21st centuries fundamentally altered relationships between taxpayers and revenue authorities, as computerization, electronic filing, real-time information systems, and data analytics created unprecedented governmental capabilities for monitoring economic transactions, detecting non-compliance, and enforcing tax obligations, while simultaneously creating new forms of taxpayer service and simplified compliance procedures that reduced burdens for those willing to meet their obligations honestly. The introduction of self-assessment for income tax in 1996 represented a fundamental shift in administrative philosophy from a system in which tax authorities calculated liabilities based on information provided by taxpayers to a system in which taxpayers themselves calculated their liabilities and submitted returns that revenue authorities would subsequently audit and verify, creating both greater compliance burdens for taxpayers who now bore responsibility for accurate calculations and greater enforcement challenges for authorities who had to verify millions of self-calculated returns rather than performing initial calculations themselves. The development of electronic filing systems during the 2000s made tax return submission more convenient, while simultaneously providing revenue authorities with data in immediately analyzable electronic formats that enabled sophisticated analytical techniques for identifying high-risk returns, requiring detailed examination, with algorithms detecting anomalies and patterns suggesting non-compliance far more effectively than traditional manual review procedures could accomplish. The implementation of real-time information for pay-as-you-earn in 2013 created systems by which employers reported wage payments and tax withholdings to revenue authorities immediately, rather than annually, providing authorities with current information about employment and earnings that enabled more accurate tax credit calculations and benefit determinations, while also creating administrative burdens for employers who had to submit information after each payroll run rather than annually. The expansion of information exchange between tax authorities and third parties, including banks, investment firms, and other financial institutions, created comprehensive data collection systems that provided authorities with independent verification of income and assets that taxpayers might otherwise fail to report, substantially reducing the scope for tax evasion, though raising privacy concerns about the extent of governmental surveillance of private financial affairs. The use of data analytics and artificial intelligence in tax enforcement during the 2010s enabled revenue authorities to identify patterns of aggressive tax avoidance and evasion with unprecedented sophistication, analyzing relationships between entities, tracing fund flows across jurisdictions, and detecting arrangements designed to conceal taxable income or artificially reduce tax liabilities. Though the technical complexity of these systems and the resources required to develop and maintain them created capabilities gaps between revenue authorities in wealthy countries with substantial IT investments and those in developing countries that lacked comparable technological resources. The digitalization of taxation created opportunities for improved taxpayer service through online portals that provided account information, enabled electronic payment, and offered automated assistance with common compliance questions, reducing costs for both taxpayers and authorities while improving accuracy and timeliness of tax administration. Though digital divides meant that populations lacking internet access or digital literacy faced disadvantages in navigating increasingly online-focused tax systems, the challenges of international tax competition and coordination became increasingly salient during the late 20th and early 21st centuries, as globalization created opportunities for both legal tax planning that exploited differences between national tax systems and illegal tax evasion through hiding assets in offshore jurisdictions, prompting efforts at international cooperation to prevent base erosion and profit shifting while preserving legitimate national tax policy autonomy. The development of transfer pricing rules governing how multinational enterprises valued transactions between related entities in different tax jurisdictions represented attempts to prevent artificial profit shifting to low tax countries through manipulation of prices charged for goods, services, intellectual property, and financing between subsidiaries. Though the technical complexity of determining arm's length prices for unique transactions between related parties created substantial controversy and frequent disputes between taxpayers and revenue authorities. The growth of intellectual property taxation as a key issue in international tax competition reflected the increasing importance of intangible assets, including patents, trademarks, and proprietary technologies in modern economies, as multinational enterprises could relatively easily locate ownership of these assets in low-tax jurisdictions and then charge high royalty payments to subsidiaries in high-tax countries, shifting profits without requiring any changes in actual business operations or locations of productive activities. The development of patent box regimes in multiple European countries, including the United Kingdom, created special low tax rates for income derived from intellectual property exploitation, representing explicit governmental decisions to compete for mobile intellectual property through favorable tax treatment. Though critics argued these regimes created harmful tax competition that reduced overall governmental revenues while providing windfall benefits to pharmaceutical companies and other IP-intensive businesses, without generating corresponding increases in actual research activities or innovations. The OECD's Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Project, initiated in 2013, represented the most comprehensive international effort to address corporate tax avoidance through developing common standards for preventing artificial profit shifting, improving transparency through country-by-country reporting requirements, and coordinating national tax policies to eliminate gaps and mismatches that enabled aggressive tax planning. Though implementation proved challenging, as countries retained sovereignty over their tax systems and faced incentives to defect from coordinated approaches, if doing so would attract investment. The introduction of diverted profits tax in 2015 created a UK-specific measure targeting artificial arrangements by which multinational enterprises diverted profits from the UK to low-tax jurisdictions, imposing a 25% rate substantially higher than the ordinary corporate rate on profits deemed to have been artificially diverted, representing a more aggressive unilateral approach than traditional transfer pricing enforcement, though creating complexity and potential double taxation when other countries did not recognize UK characterizations of transactions as artificial. The debate about digital services taxes emerged during the 2010s as governments recognized that digital businesses, including social media platforms, search engines, and online marketplaces, generated substantial value from users in their jurisdictions, but often paid minimal taxes due to ability to operate remotely without physical presence that traditional tax rules required for taxing jurisdiction, prompting unilateral digital services taxes in UK and other countries alongside multilateral negotiations through the OECD for comprehensive reforms of international tax rules to address digitalization's challenges. The evolution of environmental taxation during the late 20th and early 21st centuries reflected growing recognition that tax policy could address market failures related to pollution and resource depletion by creating price signals that internalized environmental costs that market prices otherwise failed to capture. Though the practical implementation of environmental taxes raised complex questions about their economic efficiency, distributional fairness, and political acceptability. The introduction of landfill tax in 1996 represented an early environmental tax designed to discourage waste disposal through landfills by imposing charges per ton of waste, creating incentives for waste reduction, recycling, and alternative disposal methods. Though questions arose about whether the tax rates were set at appropriate levels to generate optimal behavioral changes and about how revenues should be used, with arguments that environmental tax revenues should fund environmental improvements rather than simply flowing into general governmental coffers. The climate change levy introduced in 2001 imposed taxes on energy use by businesses, with the explicit purpose of encouraging energy efficiency and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, representing a more ambitious attempt to use taxation to address climate change. Though the exemptions granted to energy-intensive industries to protect their international competitiveness created equity concerns and reduced the policy's environmental effectiveness. The debates about carbon taxation during the 2000s and 2010s involved fundamental questions about policy design, including whether carbon taxes or cap-and-trade systems would more effectively reduce emissions, how to prevent carbon leakage through which industries relocated to countries without carbon constraints, how to address distributional concerns about carbon taxes' regressive impacts on low-income households that spent large portions of income on energy, and how to coordinate national carbon pricing with international climate agreements. The introduction of vehicle excise duties with rates varying based on carbon emissions represented attempts to use existing tax instruments to encourage lower emission vehicle choices. Though questions arose about whether the rate differentials were sufficient to meaningfully influence consumer behavior, and about the fiscal consequences, as improving fuel efficiency reduced fuel duty revenues that had historically provided substantial government income. The plastic packaging tax, introduced in 2022, demonstrated continuing evolution of environmental taxation through creating levies on plastic packaging with insufficient recycled content, attempting to encourage circular economy approaches that reduced virgin plastic production and increased recycling, though implementation challenges included defining what materials qualified as plastic, verifying recycled content percentages, and ensuring the tax created desired behavioral changes rather than simply imposing compliance costs without environmental benefits. The political economy of environmental taxation revealed tensions between environmental objectives and concerns about economic competitiveness, with businesses resisting taxes that increased costs without comparable burdens on international competitors, while environmental advocates argued for much more aggressive carbon pricing and broader environmental taxes that would fundamentally reshape economic incentives towards sustainable practices, creating political stalemates that often resulted in environmental taxes set at levels too low to generate substantial behavioral change, while high enough to create political controversy. The persistence of tax avoidance and evasion as challenges for revenue authorities, despite technological advances and international cooperation efforts, demonstrated the continuing resourcefulness of those seeking to minimize tax obligations and the inherent difficulties of designing tax systems that could effectively reach all taxable economic activity without creating excessive compliance burdens or economic distortions. The distinction between legal tax avoidance involving arrangements that minimize tax within the letter, if not the spirit of the law, and illegal tax evasion through concealment of taxable income or assets created complex ethical and policy questions about where legitimate tax planning ended and objectionable behavior requiring governmental response began. The development of general anti-avoidance rules in UK tax law during the 2010s represented attempts to combat aggressive tax avoidance by creating broad principles, allowing authorities to disregard transactions lacking commercial substance beyond tax reduction, though the challenge remained distinguishing between acceptable tax planning that Parliament implicitly permitted through not explicitly prohibiting it, and abusive arrangements that violated broader purposes of tax legislation, even if technically complying with specific statutory language. The aggressive marketed avoidance schemes that proliferated during the 1990s and 2000s demonstrated how specialized tax advisors could develop and sell complex arrangements promising large tax savings to high-income individuals and businesses, often based on technical interpretations of legislative language that Parliament clearly had not intended, prompting governmental responses including accelerated payment requirements, promoter penalties, and disclosure rules requiring notification of tax arrangements, displaying specified hallmarks, suggesting avoidance potential. The use of offshore structures and tax havens to conceal assets and income from revenue authorities remained a persistent challenge despite increased international information exchange, with wealthy individuals and multinational enterprises continuing to utilize complex corporate structures spanning multiple jurisdictions to obscure beneficial ownership and shift income to low-tax locations. Though the development of common reporting standards and automatic information exchange between tax authorities during the 2010s substantially reduced the effectiveness of traditional tax haven strategies that relied on bank secrecy. The high-profile tax controversies involving large multinational technology companies that paid minimal UK taxes, despite substantial UK revenues, demonstrated both the technical legal complexities of international taxation and the UK tax's national taxation, political pressures demanding reforms when public perceptions of tax fairness were violated by arrangements that seemed designed primarily for tax reduction, rather than reflecting genuine business structures, prompting both legislative responses and voluntary agreements by which some companies increased their UK tax payments. The philosophical questions underlying tax avoidance debates involved fundamental issues about the nature of law and civic obligation, with arguments that taxpayers had no duty to pay more tax than law required, regardless of legislative intent, conflicting with positions that citizenship involved obligations to support governmental functions through payment of taxes in amounts reflecting both letter and spirit of law, creating tensions that legal rules alone could not fully resolve, and that required ongoing political and social negotiation about acceptable bounds of tax minimization behavior. The continuing evolution of income tax structures during the early 21st century saw both Labour and subsequent Conservative governments making adjustments to rates, brackets, and allowances that reflected changing fiscal pressures, political priorities, and economic conditions, creating a dynamic policy environment in which taxpayers faced regular modifications to their obligations that complicated planning while demonstrating responsive governance. The introduction of the 50% additional rate on incomes exceeding £150,000 in 2010 by the Labour government represented a return to more progressive taxation at the highest income levels after proponing decades of flatter structures, though the Conservative coalition government's subsequent reduction to 45% in 2013 demonstrated continuing ideological divisions about appropriate progressivity levels and concerns that excessive rates on highest earners would drive talented individuals abroad or encourage aggressive avoidance. The substantial increases in personal allowances during the 2010s that eventually reached £12,500 by 2020 represented a different approach to providing tax relief. By removing lowest earners from income tax entirely, rather than reducing rates for all taxpayers, creating a system in which substantial portions of the population paid no income tax on earnings, while those above the threshold faced the basic rate on all income exceeding the allowance, generating debates about whether non-taxpayers should be eligible to vote on tax policy and spending decisions, given that they would not bear direct costs of increases. The withdrawal of personal allowances for incomes between £100,000 and £123,000 created a marginal rate spike, reaching 60%, when the effect of losing the allowance was combined with the higher rate, demonstrating how interactions between different provisions could create bizarre effective rate structures that violated principles of smooth progression and that created perverse incentives in specific income ranges. The complexity of income tax structures, including multiple rates, various allowances and deductions, special treatments for different income types, age-related provisions, and interactions with national insurance contributions, meant that effective marginal rates faced by taxpayers varied dramatically depending on specific circumstances, and that overall distribution of tax burdens bore limited relationship to simple descriptions of nominal rate structures, creating challenges for policy communication and public understanding of tax systems' actual operation. The debates about whether to integrate income tax and national insurance contributions into a single, combined income tax reflected recognition that maintaining separate systems created unnecessary complexity and concealed the true marginal rates taxpayers faced. Though resistance from those who viewed national insurance as insurance premiums rather than taxes, and concerns about revealing the high combined marginal rates that many middle-income taxpayers faced, prevented integration despite its Potential administrative advantages. The treatment of pension contributions and pension income through complex systems of tax relief, annual and lifetime allowances, and special withdrawal rules demonstrated how tax policy attempted to encourage retirement saving while preventing excessive tax advantages for highest earners. Though the frequent changes to pension tax rules created uncertainty that complicated retirement planning and sometimes discouraged, rather than encouraged, saving, as individuals struggled to understand rules that seemed to change with every budget. The fiscal pressures created by the 2008 financial crisis and subsequent recession forced substantial increases in taxation across multiple bases as governments attempted to reduce deficits and stabilize national debt levels that had increased dramatically due to both economic contraction that reduced revenues and increased expenditure for bank rescues and economic stimulus measures. The increase in standard VAT rate from 17.5% to 20% in 2011 represented one of the most significant indirect tax increases in modern British history, generating substantial revenue while also reducing real incomes as prices rose to reflect the higher tax, with particular impacts on lower-income households that spent larger portions of their income on consumption and that therefore bore relatively greater burdens from consumption tax increases. The freeze in various tax thresholds and allowances during the 2010s effectively increased tax burdens through fiscal drag, as inflation and nominal income growth moved taxpayers into higher brackets or above allowance thresholds without any explicit rate increases, demonstrating how governments could increase taxation through inaction that attracted less political attention than overt rate increases while still generating substantial additional revenue. The introduction of the bank levy in 2011 created a special tax on bank balance sheets, designed both to generate revenue from the financial sector that many blamed for the economic crisis, and to create incentives for banks to reduce leverage and risky activities, though questions arose about whether the levy rates were appropriate for these objectives and about how the costs were ultimately borne between shareholders, employees, and customers. The austerity policies pursued during the 2010s combined tax increases with spending reductions in attempts to reduce deficit levels, creating political controversies about the appropriate balance between revenue increases and expenditure cuts, and about the distributional consequences of austerity measures that critics argued fell disproportionately on lower income populations dependent on public services, while protecting wealthier groups through limited income tax increases and capital gains tax rates remaining below income tax rates. The debate about whether austerity was economically necessary or whether higher deficits should have been maintained to support economic recovery reflected broader macroeconomic controversies about fiscal policy's appropriate role during economic downturns, with arguments that premature fiscal consolidation had slowed recovery and reduced overall well-being, conflicting with positions that unsustainable debt levels required immediate attention regardless of short-term economic costs. The fiscal consequences of Brexit, including both the immediate economic disruption and the longer-term impacts on trade, investment, and economic growth, created additional challenges for tax policy as governmental revenue projections had to account for various scenarios regarding future economic relationships with European Union and broader global trading partners. Though the pandemic-induced economic crisis beginning in 2020 so dominated fiscal policy that isolating Brexit-specific impacts proved analytically difficult, the extraordinary fiscal response to the COVID-19 pandemic during 2020 and 2021 demonstrated both the fiscal capacity that centuries of institutional development had created and the continuing centrality of taxation policy to governmental ability to respond to national emergencies, as programs including furlough schemes, business support grants, and various other emergency measures required expenditure approaching £400 billion, financed through borrowing that increased national debt to levels approaching 100% of GDP, the highest since the period following World War II. The temporary reduction of VAT for hospitality and tourism sectors, the stamp duty holiday for property purchases, and various other tax relief measures represented attempts to support specific industries severely impacted by lockdowns and social distancing requirements, though questions arose about effectiveness of these measures and about the fiscal cost-benefit trade-offs involved in temporary tax reductions that benefited some groups while requiring either higher borrowing or higher taxes. Elsewhere, the relative smoothness with which the furlough scheme and other emergency programs were implemented despite their unprecedented scale demonstrated how technological advancement and administrative development had created governmental capabilities for rapid fiscal response that would have been unimaginable in earlier emergencies. Though the inevitable errors, fraudulent claims, and overpayments that occurred alongside the legitimate support reflected continuing tensions between speed of response and careful verification that characterized crisis policymaking. The post-pandemic fiscal consolidation challenges involving decisions about whether and how rapidly to increase taxes or reduce spending to stabilize debt levels created intense political debates about burden distribution and economic fiscal priorities, with particular controversies about the national insurance increase announced in 2021 to fund health and social care that broke manifesto pledges against tax increases while falling on working-age populations, rather than wealthier retirees whose care needs the revenues would primarily support. The pandemic's revelation of profound inequalities in both economic impacts and fiscal policy benefits, with low-wage workers in frontline service jobs bearing severe health and economic risks, while many higher-income professionals continued working remotely with minimal disruption and with various support programs providing greatest benefits to those with significant prior earnings, rather than to lowest-paid workers who were often ineligible, created pressures for more progressive taxation and greater redistribution that competed with countervailing pressures for fiscal consolidation and limited tax increases. The trajectory of English taxation from its origins in Anglo-Saxon customary obligations through the sophisticated multi-layered systems of the early 21st century demonstrates remarkable continuity alongside profound transformation, with each era's fiscal arrangements reflecting both inheritance from previous periods and adaptations to contemporary circumstances, including military pressures, economic structures, technological capabilities, political institutions, and social values. The persistence of fundamental taxation principles, including the requirement for consent, whether through Parliament or earlier representative mechanisms, the expectation that taxation should relate to ability to pay, even if this principle was often honoured more in breach than observance, and the recognition that excessive taxation could provoke resistance that threatened governmental legitimacy, created constraints that operated across centuries, despite dramatic changes in specific institutional forms and policy details. The administrative evolution from customary obligations collected through local lords and officials with minimal written records through the sophisticated computerized systems of modern revenue authorities, capable of tracking millions of taxpayers and billions of transactions, demonstrates how institutional capabilities shaped fiscal possibilities, with each era's taxation limited not only by political factors, but also by practical capabilities for assessment, collection, and enforcement that technological and organizational development gradually expanded. The relationship between taxation and state formation proved reciprocal and reinforcing, as fiscal pressures drove institutional innovations, including parliamentary development, bureaucratic professionalization, and administrative centralization, while enhanced state capacity enabled more effective taxation that funded further governmental expansion in self-reinforcing cycles that produced the extensive governmental apparatus of modern states. The distributional consequences of taxation flowing from decisions about what to tax and at what rates, who would bear ultimate burdens after economic adjustments occurred, and how revenues would be spent, shaped social structures and economic opportunities across generations, with tax policy contributing to both periods of increasing equality, when progressive taxation redistributed income and wealth, and periods of increasing inequality, when regressive taxation, or tax reductions for highest earners, exacerbated market-driven disparities. The international dimensions of taxation that emerged tentatively in medieval customs duties, but that became central concerns by the late 20th century, reflected the internationalization of economic activity that created both opportunities for tax avoidance through international structures and necessities for international cooperation to maintain effective taxation of mobile capital and multinational enterprises, challenges that would intensify as globalization continued and as digital technologies enabled economic activity increasingly detached from specific geographic locations. The ideological conflicts surrounding taxation that animated political debates in every period reflected deeper philosophical divisions about individual liberty versus collective responsibility, property rights versus governmental authority, economic efficiency versus distributional equity, and the proper scope of governmental activity in societies, divisions that taxation crystallized because fiscal policy required concrete decisions about these abstract principles with tangible consequences for all citizens. The legacy of English taxation history for contemporary policy includes both specific institutional inheritances, like Parliament's exclusive authority over money, bills, and broader principles about consent, representation, and limited government that emerged from centuries of fiscal conflicts and that continue to shape expectations about how taxation should operate in democratic societies. Even as modern challenges, including climate change, demographic aging, inequality, and internationalization, create pressures for innovations that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations of taxpayers and policymakers.